Caleb McAllister struck a match against the porch rail, held the burning newspaper up to the wind, and let the flames eat every word before the ink could shame him twice. "Let 'em laugh," he said to the empty mountain. "Let every last one of 'em laugh." But 100 miles east, at a telegraph desk in a rail town, a woman named Hannah Brooks read that same notice and set down her pen. If you're watching, subscribe, and stay with me to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The notice ran on a Tuesday in the classifieds of the Millbrook Weekly Ledger, wedged between a lost heifer and a foreclosure sale, and by Wednesday, half the county had read it aloud at least once. It did not read the way such notices read. Most men who advertised for a wife led with their acres, their cattle, their standing. They wrote of good Christian character and steady hands and a house already built. They lied politely the way lonely men do, dressing up thin lives in Sunday clothes so a stranger might board a train and gamble her whole future on the difference between the words and the man who wrote them. Caleb McAllister did not lie. His notice began with a single line, and it was that line that made grown men slap their knees at the mercantile counter. "I have one leg. I own 300 acres on the mountain edge. I do not pretend to be what I am not. If honesty is worth more to you than a whole man's promises, write to Caleb McAllister, route out of Fulton." "One leg," wheezed Ezra Pratt, the mercantile owner, folding the paper so the whole store could see. "Fella leads with one leg, like a man'd sell a lame horse and put the limp in the first line." The men gathered around the Cracker Barrel laughed the way men laugh when they are relieved it isn't them. "Reckon he ought to have mentioned the good parts first," said one. "What good parts?" said another, and the laughter came again, uglier this time. At the telegraph desk across the street behind a window streaked with summer dust, Hannah Brooks heard it. She heard most things. The telegraph office sat at the center of Millbrook, the way a heart sits at the center of a body, and every rumor, every death, every fortune won and lost passed through the wire under her fingers before it passed through anyone's mouth. She had learned the town by its secrets long before she'd learned it by its faces. She had a copy of the ledger open on the desk beside her key. She read the notice once. Then she read it again. And then, without meaning to, she stopped tapping the wire mid-message, and the operator down the line in Fulton clicked out an impatient query. "Go ahead, go ahead." And she did not answer him, because for the space of 3 breaths, Hannah Brooks was somewhere else entirely. "I do not pretend to be what I am not." She had spent 11 years reading men's words. She read them for a living. She read the words of husbands wiring money they didn't have, and the words of gamblers promising they'd quit, and the words of suitors in 3 different towns pouring honey down the wire to 3 different women who each believed herself the only one. She had learned that words were the cheapest thing a man owned, cheaper than bullets, cheaper than whiskey, and that a man would spend 1,000 of them before he'd spend a single true one. And here was a man who had opened with the ugliest truth he had and set it before strangers like a card laid face up. "You gonna finish that message, Hannah, or you gonna let Fulton think the wire's dead?" The voice belonged to Deborah Wills, the postmistress, who shared the front room and half the gossip. Hannah's fingers found the key again. "I'm finishing it." "You went white as a sheet just now." "I did not." "You did. Reading that fool notice weren't you." Deborah leaned over the counter to see. "The one-legged rancher. Whole town's having a time with it." "I noticed. Ezra says he'll not get a single reply. Says a man that'd advertise his own crippling has got no more sense than pride." Deborah shook her head, but there was a softness under the scorn the way there sometimes was in her. "Sad, though. Sad thing to do to yourself. Announce it to the county like that." Hannah finished the Fulton message and let the key go quiet. "He didn't announce his crippling," she said. "Course he did. It's the first line." "He announced his honesty." Hannah pulled the paper toward her and looked at the line again. And something in her chest that had been shut a long time turned over once painfully, like a key in a lock gone stiff from disuse. The leg's just what he was honest about. Deborah didn't have an answer for that. She rarely did when Hannah talked that way, which was why the two of them had lasted 6 years as friends, without ever once truly understanding each other. 90-odd miles west, and a good deal higher, where the flatland gave up and the mountains began. In earnest, Caleb McAllister was setting a fence post when the boy from Fulton rode up the switchback to tell him the whole town was laughing. Caleb didn't stop working. He tamped the dirt down around the post with the flat end of the maul, tested it with a shove of his shoulder, and reached for the next one before he answered. "That's so." "Yes, sir." The boy, Tommy Rourke, 14, and freckled and honest to a fault, which was why Caleb tolerated him, sat his horse uneasily. "Down at the feed store, Mr. Pratt read it out, and at the barber shop, and Miss Callahan said, 'I don't need the roll call, Tommy.'" "No, sir." Caleb set the post. Behind him, 300 acres of mountain summer rolled up toward the ridgeline green, going gold, the grass tall enough to hide a calf, and he had cleared and fenced and bled for every foot of it with one leg of his own, and one of carved hickory that a saddler in Cheyenne had made him for the price of a yearling. "They say anything I didn't already know about myself?" Caleb asked. "Sir." "The town. In all that laughing, they discover anything I wasn't already aware of?" Tommy thought about it, which was one of the things Caleb liked in him. He was a boy who thought before he spoke, and Caleb reckoned that put him ahead of 2/3 of the grown men in the county. "No, sir, I don't guess they did." "Then they didn't tell me nothing." Caleb straightened, wiped his palm on his trousers, and finally looked at the boy. His face was weathered the color of a saddle, and older than his 39 years, and there was a stillness in it that most men mistook for coldness until they'd known him long enough to learn it was the opposite, that it was a man holding himself very carefully. The way you hold something that has already been broken once and mended. "You ride up here to tell me I'm a laughingstock?" "No, sir." Tommy went red. "I rode up because I figured you'd want to hear it from a friend before you heard it from a stranger. So you wouldn't be caught out." And Caleb, who had not smiled in front of another human being in a long while, felt something move at the corner of his mouth. "That was decent of you." "My ma says you're the most honest man in the territory." "Your ma's a kind woman with poor eyesight. She says the town's laughing 'cause they're ashamed. She says a man who tells the truth makes liars nervous." Caleb looked at the boy a moment. Then he reached into the wagon bed for the water jug, took a long pull, and passed it up. "Your ma," he said, "is smarter than every man at that feed store put together. Drink. It's a long ride back, and the sun's mean today." He hadn't written the notice out of loneliness. That was what the town got wrong, and it was what Hannah Brooks 90 miles east got right, or that wasn't the whole of it. A man alone on a mountain feels the winter more than the summer, and Caleb had felt the last 3 winters like a hand closing slow around his throat. There was work enough to keep a body busy from dark to dark, but the nights were long, and the porch step he'd built wide enough for 2 people sat with only one on it, and there were evenings he caught himself talking to the dog just to hear a voice that wasn't the wind. But a lonely man could have written a lonely man's notice. Could have written of his acres and left the leg for later, for after she'd come for after it was too far along to undo. Plenty did. Caleb had known a man in Laramie who'd written a woman clear from Ohio without once mentioning he was near 60 and near blind, and she'd come and she'd stayed, because by then what else could she do? A woman alone in a strange territory, with no money for the fare home. Caleb had watched that marriage sour into something that made him ashamed to share a species with the man. He would not do that to a woman. He had decided it lying awake one January night with the wind screaming down off the ridge, decided it as plain as he'd ever decided anything. If a woman was going to bind her life to his, she was going to do it, knowing exactly what she was binding it to. The leg, the isolation, the scarred and quiet man who came with the land. So he'd led with the leg. Because it was the thing a liar would hide, and he was not a liar, and he wanted her, whoever she might be, if she existed at all, to know that about him before she knew anything else. Let the town laugh. The town had been laughing at Caleb McAllister in one form or another since the day they'd carried him out of the Fulton sawmill with his boots still on the foot they'd had to leave behind. He'd survived their pity, which was worse than their laughter. He could survive this. What he had not counted on, what no part of him had let itself hope for, was that anyone would answer. Oh, the letter came 11 days later. Tommy Rourke brought it up the switchback at a dead gallop, standing in his stirrups, hollering before he was even in the yard. "Mr. McAllister! Mr. McAllister, there's a letter." Caleb was mending harness on the porch step. He set the awl down very carefully. "Whoa now, what are you hollering about?" "A letter. Come to the Fulton Post for you, and Mr. Dabney says he's never seen you get a letter that wasn't from the bank, and he made me swear to bring it up careful and not lose it, and I didn't lose it. See?" The boy was off his horse and up the steps, holding out an envelope gone soft at the corners from being clutched the whole ride. "It's a lady's hand, sir. On the writing, it's a lady's hand." Caleb took it. It was a lady's hand. Small and even and unhurried, the hand of someone who wrote for a living and had long since burned all the flourish out of it. The direction read simply, "Mr. Caleb McAllister, route out of Fulton." There was no return name, but the postmark said Millbrook. "Ain't you gonna open it?" Tommy was practically vibrating. "In a minute." "But it's from a lady." "I can read the hand, same as you, Tommy." "Then open it." Caleb turned the envelope over. His own name in that steady hand looked strange to him, softer than he'd ever felt himself to be. For 11 days he had told himself no one would answer, had told himself so firmly that he'd almost come to want it, because a man who expects nothing cannot be disappointed, and Caleb McAllister had built a whole life on the foundation of expecting nothing. Now here it was. And he found he was afraid to open it, and he did not care to be afraid in front of the boy. "Go water your horse," he said. "He's blown. You ran him up that grade like the devil was after you. But horse first, always the horse first. You want to be the kind of man leaves a good animal standing lathered while he reads his mail. Go on." Tommy went casting looks back over his shoulder the whole way to the trough, and when he was gone, Caleb sat down on the wide porch step he had built with his own 2 hands and 1 good leg, and he opened the letter. It did not read the way he'd feared. He'd feared pity. He'd feared the careful, wincing kindness of a woman writing to a cripple out of Christian charity. He'd feared worse, the false brightness of a desperate woman willing to overlook the leg for the acres, already counting his cattle in her head. The letter had none of that. "Mr. McAllister, I read your notice in the Ledger. I am the telegraph operator here in Millbrook, which means I read a great many words that men send to women, and I will tell you plainly that most of them are lies. I have spent 11 years reading lies. I have gotten good at it. Yours were not lies. That is why I am writing. You put your leg first. I understand why, though I doubt the men laughing at you down at the Mercantile do. You put it first because it is the thing a lesser man would hide, and you wanted whoever read it to know you would not hide things from her. I want you to know that I read it correctly. I want you to know that at least one person in this county did. I will not pretend I am writing to accept a proposal you did not make. You advertised for honesty, not for a wife who leaps at strangers. So let me be honest in return, since that seems to be the coin you deal in. I am 32 years old. My parents are dead. I have no beauty to speak of, and no fortune at all, and I have long since stopped expecting either love or its imitation, having watched too much of the imitation pass under my fingers on the wire. I value one thing above all others, and it is the thing you led with, and I did not believe I would find it advertised in a newspaper between a lost heifer and a bank sale. I do not know if we would suit. I know only that I would rather correspond with an honest man about the truth than with 100 liars about a dream. If you care to write back, I will read it. Hannah Brooks, Millbrook. Caleb read it 3 times. The first time fast, the way a man crosses a river he's afraid of. The second time, slow, weighing each line. The third time he read it aloud quietly to the mountain and the dog and the empty half of the porch step. And when he came to the line, "I want you to know that I read it correctly," his voice caught, and he had to stop, and he sat there a long moment with the paper in his weathered hands, and something wet standing in his eyes that he would have denied to any living soul. Because in 3 years on that mountain, in 11 days of laughter from a whole county, in a lifetime of being looked at first as a whole man to be envied, and then as a broken one to be pitied, No one had read him correctly. And a stranger, 90 miles east, a woman he had never seen, had read him in a single line of newsprint, the way he had never in his life been read. "Mr. McAllister." Tommy was back, hat in hand, watching him with a boy's frank worry. "You all right, sir? You look—" "I'm fine, Tommy." "You're crying." "I'm not." "You are, though." "It's all right. My pa cried when my sister was born, and he's the toughest." "Tommy." Caleb folded the letter along its creases, slow and careful, and slid it back into the soft envelope, and he found his voice was not entirely steady when he spoke. "You ever done a thing that folks laughed at, really laughed? And you did it anyway, 'cause you knew it was right, even though everybody you knew told you it was fool's business?" Tommy considered this with his customary seriousness. "I gave my lunch to the Perkins kids most of last winter," he said, "'cause their pa drinks and there weren't food, and the other fellas said I was soft, called me names." "You keep giving it." "Yes, sir. They needed it worse than I did." Caleb looked at the boy a long moment. "You gave your lunch to hungry children and the town called you soft," he said. "I told the truth about my own leg and the town called me a fool. Reckon you and I are in the same business, Tommy, and I reckon it's a better business than theirs, whatever they say at the feed store." He stood tucking the letter into his breast pocket over his heart, though he'd have died before he'd have named it that. "Now, I've got a letter to answer, and I want it done right, and I write slow. So you'll stay to supper, and you'll carry it down to the Fulton Post in the morning, and you'll guard it with your life. Can you do that?" Tommy's whole face lit like the sun coming over the ridge. "Yes, sir, with my life, sir." "Don't get carried away. It's a letter, not the mail train." But there was warmth in it, and the boy heard the warmth and grinned all the wider. "Go on and see to the chickens while there's light. I need to think on what I'm going to say." What he said in the end took him the better part of the night and 4 ruined sheets of paper. Caleb McAllister could set a fence line straight as a rifle shot across a mountain grade. He could birth a calf backward in a spring blizzard, could shoe a horse that had thrown 3 other men, could fell a tree so it dropped within a foot of where he'd called it. His hands knew 100 kinds of work. They did not know this. He sat at the plank table, with the lamp guttering and the dog asleep against his boot, the real one, and he tried 3 times to write something clever and threw all 3 away, because clever was a liar's tool, and he'd already told this woman he wasn't a liar. So in the end, he wrote the way he'd written the notice. Plain, true, the ugliest thing first. Miss Brooks, I have started this letter 4 times. I am better with a fence than a pen, so I will ask you to forgive the plainness of it. You are the only one who wrote. The whole county read that notice, and one person in it answered, and it was you, and you answered by telling me you read a great many lies, and mine were not among them. I have read your letter more times than I will admit to. I read it out loud to my dog, who was not much impressed, but I was. You said you have no beauty and no fortune. I did not ask for either. I have looked at beauty. A woman I was to marry before the accident was as fine to look at as anything in the territory, and when they carried me out of that mill without my leg, she looked at me exactly once and never came again. So I have no high opinion of beauty. It did not stand by me. I do not imagine it would stand by you either when the hard times came, and out here the hard times always come. You said you have stopped expecting love. I stopped too. 3 years back on this mountain, I stopped. I built a porch step wide enough for 2 because I am a stubborn fool who would not let go of the hope even after I'd told myself it was dead. I have sat on the one side of it for 3 years. I do not know if we would suit either. But I would rather find out with you who tells the truth than go on sitting alone on half a step out of pride. Tell me true things. I will tell you true things back. We will see where the truth takes us, since it seems to be the only road either of us trusts. I have 1 leg. I have 300 acres. And now I have your letter, which I am keeping, and which I read to my dog. Caleb McAllister. He read it over once, decided it was as honest as he could make it, and did not let himself read it again for fear he'd lose his nerve. Then he sealed it, and set it on the table where Tommy could not miss it, and blew out the lamp, and lay a long while in the dark, listening to the mountain. And for the first time in 3 years, the wind did not sound like a hand closing around his throat. Down in Millbrook, the town did not stop laughing just because a letter had gone unnoticed up a mountain. If anything, it got worse because word had leaked. Words always leaked in a town with a telegraph office and a postmistress that the one-legged rancher had gotten himself a reply. Somebody actually wrote him. Ezra Pratt was incredulous. Who in their right mind? Now Ezra, said Deborah Wills, who had brought the news precisely because she couldn't hold it and was now regretting the whole enterprise. It's not our business who wrote him. It's the whole county's business near about. Man advertises his own leg and some poor addled female answers it. Ezra shook his head. Be a mercy if the postmaster lost the thing. You watch your mouth, Ezra Pratt. The voice cut across the store like a blade, and every head turned. Hannah Brooks stood in the doorway with the light behind her, and she was not a large woman, nor a loud one, and in 6 years in Millbrook, she had never once raised her voice in that store or any other. She raised it now. You watch your mouth, she said again, and crossed the floor to the counter, and set down her list of dry goods with a snap. The man told the truth about himself to a whole county, which is more than any soul in this store has ever done. And you sit here on your barrel and call him addled and a fool. Well, she looked around the room at Ezra, at the loafers by the Cracker Barrel, at the faces that had laughed. I'll tell you who wrote him since you're all so curious. I did. The silence was total. You, said Ezra. Me. You wrote, you answered the Hannah you can't be. I read men's lies for a living, Ezra. 11 years of them straight off the wire. And in 11 years, that notice was the first true thing I ever read a man put his name to. Her voice did not shake. Her hands flat on the counter did not shake. So yes, I wrote him. And I'd thank you to keep his name and mine out of your mouth, unless you can say them with respect, because a man who leads with his ugliest truth has got more honor in his one leg than this whole town's got standing on two. She picked up her list. Now, I'll take my flour and my coffee, Mr. Pratt, and I'll take them from you same as always, because I hold no grudge against a man who's only ignorant. But you'll fill the order without the commentary. Do we understand each other? Ezra Pratt, who had run that store for 20 years and never once been made to feel small in it, filled the order without a word. And Deborah Wills, watching her friend, felt something she couldn't name. Half fear, half a fierce and startling pride, and thought not for the first time that she had never truly understood Hannah Brooks, and that maybe nobody in Millbrook ever had. Oh, the letters went back and forth across 90 miles of summer that year, like a slow current finding its channel. He wrote of the mountain, of the wind that came down off the ridge at dusk, and how it had frightened him his first winter, and how he'd come to need it. Of the fences, always the fences, and the calf he'd lost in a spring flood, and the 2 he'd saved. Of the porch step. Of the dog who was named Ruin, because he'd been a ruined-looking pup when Caleb found him half drowned in a ditch, and because a man alone on a mountain develops a sense of humor about ruin. She wrote of the wire. Of the deaths that came through it, and the fortunes and the marriages announced, and the marriages ended. Of her parents gone in the same fever winter when she was 19, and how she'd learned the telegraph because it was the one trade a woman could get that didn't require her to smile at men she despised. Of the boarding house and the thin walls and the loneliness that was somehow worse in a town full of people than it would have been alone on a mountain. You are not alone in the loneliness, he wrote her once. That is the strange thing. I am 90 miles away on a mountain, and I read your letters, and I think there is another one. Another one who knows. Another one who knows, she wrote back. Yes. I did not think there was. Neither of them wrote the word that hung behind all the others. Neither of them flirted. Neither of them made promises. They had both spent their lives among promises, and they trusted the small true things far more than the large sweet ones trusted a man writing about a drowned dog he'd saved, more than they'd ever have trusted a man writing about the color of their eyes. But somewhere in that summer of letters, without either of them ever saying it, the thing that neither would name took root and grew. the way the tall grass grew up. His mountain, quiet and green and impossible to stop. And then in August, Caleb McAllister took up his pen and wrote the hardest true thing he'd written yet. Miss Brooks, I have thought a long time about how to write this, and there is no clever way, so I will do it plain, which is the only way I know. I do not want to go on writing letters forever. I have come to care for you through these pages more than I have cared for anyone since before the accident, and a man does not build a porch step for two, so he can go on reading a woman's words by lamplight 90 miles away for the rest of his life. That is not what the step is for. So I am going to ask you plain, and you can say no plain, and I will not think less of you, and I will go on writing you as a friend the rest of my days, if that is all you want. Will you come to the mountain and see the land, and see the man, and see the leg, and see if the truth we have been telling each other on paper holds up in the flesh? I will meet the train at Fulton. If you take one look and want to go home, I will buy your ticket back myself, and never trouble you again, and I will mean it. But I do not think you will want to go home. I have read your letters more times than I will admit, and I do not think either of us wants to go home anymore. I think we are both about done being alone. Come and see. Caleb. He sent it, and then he waited, and the waiting was the worst thing he had done since the accident. Worse than learning to walk on the hickory leg, worse than the first winter alone. Because the letters, he could survive. A man could build a life around letters, around the small warmth of another one who knows arriving every 11 days like clockwork. But he had asked for more than letters now. He had laid the whole of it face up on the table the way he'd led with his leg. And if she said no, if the flesh and blood truth of him was more than the paper truth she could bear, then he would have to go back to the one side of the porch step, knowing exactly what he'd lost. And that was a colder thing than never having known it at all. He waited 14 days, the longest of his life. On the 15th, Tommy Rourke came up the switchback at a dead gallop, standing in his stirrups hollering. But this time he wasn't holding a letter. This time he was holding a telegram. Mr. McAllister, Mr. McAllister. It come over the wire, direct. She sent it herself, off her own key. Mr. Dabney says, and it's the shortest one he ever wrote down, and he made me swear, give it here. Caleb took the flimsy yellow paper with a hand that was not steady and unfolded it, and read the 4 words she had tapped out with her own fingers, 90 miles east, at the desk where she had first read his notice, and set down her pen. I have never run. And below it, the time and the date, and her name. Caleb McAllister stood on the wide porch step he had built with his own 2 hands and 1 good leg, and he read those 4 words, and then he sat down slowly on the half of it that had been empty for 3 years, and he put his face in his weathered hands. And Tommy Rourke had the great good sense, the same sense that had made him bring bad news up a mountain so a friend wouldn't be caught out. The same sense that had made him give his lunch to hungry children through a whole hard winter, to turn his horse and ride a little way off and give the man his privacy and say nothing at all about the tears. She had never run. Neither had he. And 90 miles east at the telegraph desk, where the whole thing had started, Hannah Brooks sat with her hand still resting on the key, listening to the town go about its ignorant business beyond the dusty window. And she was not afraid, and she was not laughing, and for the first time in 11 years of reading other people's words across the wire, she had sent 4 of her own that were the truest she had ever spoken. She was going to the mountain. She had already begun in the quiet of her own mind to pack. The packing did not go the way she'd imagined. Hannah Brooks had lived 11 years out of a single trunk and a carpet bag, and she had believed sitting at her key, with her hand still warm, from sending those 4 words that she could pack her whole life in an afternoon. She was wrong. Not because there was so much, because there was so little, and the little of it broke her heart to touch. You're really going, Deborah Wills said from the doorway of the boarding house room. She'd come up without knocking, which she never did, and Hannah understood from that alone that her friend was frightened. I'm really going. To a man you've never laid eyes on. On a mountain you've never seen. 90 miles from a single soul who knows your name. He knows my name. Hannah folded a shawl into the trunk. He's read it more times than he'll admit. His words, not mine. Hannah. Deborah crossed the little room and caught her by the wrist, and her grip was hard. Listen to me. I've watched 100 women board trains for men who wrote them pretty letters. You've watched them too off your own wire. Half of them we never heard from again. You told me that. You told me the wire goes quiet on a woman and you spend the rest of your life wondering. I remember telling you. Then how can you? Because he didn't write me pretty letters. Hannah turned, and there was something in her face that stopped Deborah cold, something that had not been there 6 months ago, before the notice before the wire, before 4 words tapped out of her own hand. He wrote me true ones. There's a difference, and I've spent 11 years learning it, and I would stake my life on the difference. I am staking my life on it. That's exactly what I'm doing. Deborah's grip loosened. Her eyes had gone wet. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong, and I'll have been braver being wrong than I ever was being safe. Hannah covered her friend's hand with her own. Deborah, I have been safe for 11 years. I have been so safe I stopped being alive. You know it. You've watched it. I read the whole world's joys and sorrows off that wire, and I felt none of them because feeling them would have meant admitting I had none of my own coming. Her voice thickened. He built a porch step wide enough for 2, and he sat on one side of it for 3 years out of a stubbornness that matched my own. I am done being safe. I'd rather be his kind of fool than the kind I've been. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Deborah wiped her face with the heel of her hand, hard the way she did everything, and said, Well, if you're going to be a fool, you'll not do it in that gray dress. You'll wear the blue. And I'm coming to the station to see you off, and if he's a scoundrel, you wire me 1 word, you wire me home, and I'll have the marshal on the next train before your trunk's off the platform. He's not a scoundrel. You wire me home anyway. Promise it. I promise it. And the blue dress. Hannah almost laughed, and the almost laugh cracked something loose in her chest that had been shut a very long time. And the blue dress. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Because when Hannah went down the next morning to book her passage, the Millbrook station master, a heavy-set man named Cobb, who had never once in 6 years looked at her as anything but the girl who ran the wire. He grudged paying for, leaned across his counter and said low, You're the one answered that cripple's notice. Hannah set down her fare money. I'm the one who answered Mr. McAllister's notice, yes. Word of advice free of charge. Cobb didn't touch the money. That ticket's to Fulton. You know what's in Fulton besides your one-legged rancher? I imagine you'll tell me. The Fulton sawmill. He said it like it meant something and watched her face to see if it did. The one that took his leg. And the man that owns it. Vernon Slade. He leaned closer. Slade's been trying to get McAllister's 300 acres for 6 years. Water rights. There's a creek runs off that mountain, feeds half the valley, and it crosses McAllister's land, and Slade wants it, and McAllister won't sell, and Slade is not a man accustomed to, won't. The station went very quiet around them. A fly buzzed against the window glass. That's not my business, Hannah said, and heard how thin it sounded. It's about to be. Cobb finally took the money, slow counting it. You marry that man, you marry his fight. And Slade fights dirty miss. Ask anyone in Fulton how McAllister came to lose his leg in the first place, and then ask him why the inquest never went nowhere. Ask him that. He slid her the ticket. Fulton, one way. Enjoy the ride. Hannah took the ticket with a hand she willed not to shake, and she did not give Cobb the satisfaction of a single question, and she walked out onto the platform with her spine straight as a rail line. But inside the 4 calm words she had sent, I have never run, had begun to feel less like a vow, and more like a dare she'd flung at a thing she couldn't see. Ask him how McAllister came to lose his leg, and then ask him why the inquest never went nowhere. The train was 2 days with a change at the junction, and Hannah spent the whole of it turning Cobb's words over the way she'd once turned Caleb's notice over, reading them for the lie in them or the truth. She could not find the lie. That was what frightened her. Cobb was a small, mean man, and small, mean men lied for sport, but there had been no sport in his face when he'd said water rights. There'd been something almost like a warning. As if even Cobb, who hated her, hadn't been able to let her board that train without telling her what she was riding toward. She had 11 years of The Wire behind her, and The Wire had taught her one iron law: money. Moving quietly is the most dangerous thing in the world. A man who wants your land and can't buy it will find another way to take it, and the other ways are always worse. Caleb hadn't written a word about any of it. Not one line in a whole summer of true letters. Not the sawmill, not Vernon Slade, not the water, not the inquest that went nowhere. By the time the train pulled into Fulton, in the long gold light of a summer evening, Hannah Brooks had decided two things, and decided them hard. The first was that she was still going to the mountain. The second was that the first true thing she said to Caleb McAllister face to face after 90 miles and a summer of paper was not going to be hello. She saw him before the train had fully stopped. He was standing at the far end of the platform, apart from the small knot of people waiting, his hat in his hands, and he was not looking at the train windows the way the others were searching. He was looking at one window. Hers. As if he'd known somehow exactly where she'd be sitting, though they had never exchanged so much as a photograph. And she knew him too. Instantly. Not by any description. He'd never described himself too honest to flatter and too proud to complain, but by the stillness of him. He stood the way his letters read. Plain, squared. A man holding himself very carefully because he'd been broken once and mended and did not intend to be caught off guard again. The hickory leg she saw last, and it did not matter at all exactly as she'd told him it wouldn't, and she felt a fierce satisfaction at being proven right about her own heart. She came down the steps. He came forward to meet her, one hand out for her carpet bag, and he stopped an arm's length away, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was too much, and none of it would fit in a station full of strangers. Then Caleb McAllister said, quiet the way he'd said it in his letter, the way she'd known he would, "You didn't run." And Hannah Brooks looked up into the weathered face of the only honest man she'd ever read, and did not say hello, and did not say she was glad, though she was more than she'd known a person could be. She said, "Tell me about Vernon Slade." She watched it hit him. She watched the name go into him like a splinter under a nail. Watched the careful stillness crack for just a second before he sealed it shut again. And in that second, she had her answer, and her heart dropped, because it meant Cobb had not been lying. "Where'd you hear that name?" Caleb said. "Millbrook Station, from a small, mean man who took my fare and gave me a warning I didn't ask for." She did not let go of his eyes. "He said you lost your leg in Slade's sawmill. He said Slade's wanted your 300 acres for 6 years. He said there was an inquest that went nowhere. And he said if I married you, I married your fight." She drew a breath. "You wrote me a whole summer of true things, Caleb McAllister. You told me about a drowned dog and a dead calf and a porch step. You never once told me a man was trying to take your land." For a moment she thought he'd deny it. She almost hoped he would, because a denial she could catch, a denial she'd know how to read. He didn't deny it. He set her carpet bag down on the platform slow, and he straightened, and he looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a fence line that had gone crooked in the frost, squarely without flinching, taking the true measure of a hard thing. "You're right," he said. "I didn't tell you. And I owe you the why of it, and the why is not a good one, so I'll give it to you plain, and you can judge it." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I didn't tell you because I wanted one thing in my life that Slade hadn't touched. I wanted the letters to be clean of him. Every acre I own, he's put his shadow on. The creek, the mill, my own leg, there's not a piece of my life that man hasn't reached into." His jaw worked. "And then your letters started coming, and they were the one thing that was mine, and only mine, and I could not bear to let his name into them. So I kept him out. That was selfish, and it was a kind of lie by leaving out, and you caught it inside of 2 minutes on this platform, which is exactly why I wrote you, and not some woman who couldn't." He looked at her steadily. "I should have told you. I'm telling you now. Ask me anything you want, and I'll answer it true right here, before you set one foot toward that mountain. And if the answer sends you back on the next train, I'll buy the ticket like I said, and I'll have earned it. Hannah Brooks stood on the Fulton platform in the blue dress Deborah had made her wear, and she looked at this man who had lied to her only by loving her too carefully, and she felt the last of Cobb's poison go out of her. That, she said, is the most honest lie I ever heard a man confess to. It's the only kind I've got in me. I know it is. That's why I'm here. She picked up her own carpet bag before he could a small thing, but she saw him note it and understand it. I don't want to go back on the next train. I want to hear about Vernon Slade on the way to the mountain. All of it, the leg and the inquest and the creek, and I want you to leave nothing out, because I did not come 90 miles to be protected. I came 90 miles to stand on the other side of that porch step. She looked at him. So, do we have a wagon, Mr. McAllister, or are we walking? And Caleb McAllister, who had not smiled in front of another human being in years, who had wept into his hands over 4 words on a telegram, who had built a step for 2, and sat on one side of it, out of a stubbornness that matched her own, Caleb McAllister laughed. It came out rough unused like a hinge that had rusted shut. But it came out. We have a wagon, he said, and you'll hear all of it. God help me, you'll hear all of it, and then you'll wish you'd taken Cobb's advice. I never take advice from small, mean men. Load the bag. Hey, he told her on the road. The wagon climbed out of Fulton and into the long grades toward the mountain, and Caleb held the lines loose in his weathered hands and told Hannah Brooks the thing he had kept out of a whole summer of letters, and she listened the way she'd learned to listen at the wire, for the truth under the words and the lie under the truth, and finding this time that there was no lie at all. Only a wound a man had been carrying so long, he'd learned to walk without limping on it. He'd come to the valley at 22, he said, with 2 good legs and a dead father's savings sewn into his coat. He'd meant to ranch. He'd bought the 300 acres cheap because they ran steep up the mountain and no one else wanted the grade, no one but a fool willing to fence a slope, and Caleb had been that fool, and he'd been proud of it. What he hadn't known buying it was the creek. Runs down off the high ridge, he said, nodding up toward the country ahead of them gone blue with distance. Crosses the top of my land north to south before it drops into the valley. Every farm in that valley drinks off that creek. Every head of cattle. The mill runs off it. And the law of it, the law of water in this territory, is that the man whose land the creek crosses highest has got the say. Upstream rights. And that's me. That water's mine to use first, and to dam if I've a mind to, and to sell the use of if I choose. 300 acres of steep grade nobody wanted, and it turned out to hold the throat of the whole valley in its hand. And Slade wants the throat, Hannah said. Slade owns everything downstream of it. The mill, 2,000 acres of the flat, half the town of Fulton one way or another holds paper he signed. Caleb's hands tightened on the lines. For 6 years he's offered to buy me out. Started fair. Got less fair. 2 years back he offered me 4 times what the land's worth, and I said no, and that's when it stopped being about money. What happened 2 years back? My leg happened before that. 4 years back. He was quiet a moment, and the wagon wheels turned, and Hannah did not push him, because she'd learned at the wire that the truest things come when you stop pulling on them. I worked winters at the mill, Caleb said finally. Everybody did. Ranch don't pay in the cold months, and Slade's mill was the only wage in the valley. I'd worked it 3 seasons, careful no trouble. And then one January, I'd been fighting Slade over the water he'd sent men to survey a dam site on my land without my leave, and I'd run 'em off, and there'd been words. He kept his eyes on the road. 2 days after the words, the big saw through of the guard came loose. On the saw I'd run safe for 3 seasons. Came loose while I was feeding it. And I went down, and the saw came with me, and by the time they got it stopped, I had 1 leg and a boot they buried with the foot still in it. Hannah did not gasp. She'd heard too many terrible things off the wire to gasp at a true one told plain. But her hand resting on the wagon seat between them closed slowly into a fist. The guard came loose, she said. 2 days after you crossed Vernon Slade. That's right. And the inquest went nowhere. Slade owns the coroner's paper same as everybody's. Caleb's voice was flat, worn smooth by 4 years of carrying it. "The finding was operator error. Said I fed it careless. Said a careful man keeps his guard checked, and I hadn't, and it was my own fault, and the mill bore no liability." He glanced at her once. "There were men saw that guard sound the night before, 2 of them. Neither would say so at the inquest, and I don't blame 'em, because both of 'em had families, and both of 'em owed Slade paper, and a man'll swallow a lot to keep a roof over his children. I'd have done the same in their place. I don't hold it against 'em. But you know." "I know." He said it without heat, which was somehow worse than if he'd raged. "I know the way you know a thing you can't prove and never will. Slade took my leg to soften me up, and it didn't work because I came off that mill floor meaner than I went on, and I built my ranch on one leg out of pure spite as much as anything to prove to that man he couldn't grind me down. And he spent the 4 years since trying to prove he can." He shook the lines, and the horses leaned into the grade. "So that's Vernon Slade, Miss Brooks. That's the fight you married. And you had a right to know it before you climbed on this wagon, and I'm ashamed I let a station master tell you instead of me." "What shall we?" Hannah was quiet a long moment. The wagon climbed. "I haven't married anything yet," she said finally. Caleb's hands went still on the lines. "No," he said. "No, you haven't." "I misspoke. I said I haven't yet." She turned on the seat to look at him full. "There's a difference between haven't and won't. Caleb McAllister, and you of all men, ought to know how much a single word can carry, because you built our whole acquaintance on one true line in a newspaper." Her voice was steady. "I came to see the land, and the man, and the leg. You've given me the leg now, the true story of it, which is more than the leg itself. So drive on. I've seen nothing yet that sends me back to Millbrook. I've seen a man who fought a thief for 6 years on one leg and never once whined about it in a letter. That's not a thing that sends a woman home. That's a thing that makes her wonder why she waited 32 years to find it." The mountain rose ahead of them, and the light was going gold to amber to the deep blue of a summer dusk, and Caleb McAllister drove his wagon up the last of the grade toward the ranch he'd built out of spite and stubbornness, with the first woman in 4 years who'd ever heard the whole of him, and not flinched, sitting straight-backed at his side. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said low, "Ruin's going to like you." "The dog." "The dog. He's a poor judge of most everything, but he's got a nose for honest people, runs from the rest." A pause. "He'll take one look at you and never leave your side. I'd bet the ranch on it." "Don't bet the ranch," Hannah said. "Slade wants it bad enough already." And Caleb McAllister laughed for the second time in one evening, rough and rusty and real, and up ahead, through the last of the light, the shape of the ranch came clear against the mountain. The barn he'd built by hand. The fences straight as rifle shots, and the wide wooden porch step waiting with room on it for 2. Ruin took one look at her and never left her side. The dog came off the porch like a shot when the wagon rolled into the yard and Caleb tensed. Ruin did not love strangers. Ruin had run a land surveyor clean off the property the spring before, but the dog pulled up short. 3 feet from Hannah sat down hard in the dust and looked up at her with his whole disreputable heart in his eyes. "Well," Caleb said, "I'll be. You said you'd bet the ranch. Good thing I didn't." He came around to hand her down, and she let him this time, and his hand was rough and warm and steady, and when her feet touched the ground of his mountain for the first time, she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled her whole life. She did not say so. There'd be time for saying so. He showed her the barn, and the well, and the 2 milk cows, and the horses, and the chickens. And last of all, when the dark had truly come down, and the stars had opened up over the ridge in a way she'd never seen in a town, he showed her the porch step. "This is it," he said, and there was something almost shy in him. This man who had confessed a stolen leg without flinching. The famous step, wide enough for 2, sat on the one side of it 3 years telling myself I was a fool. Hannah looked at it a long moment. Then she sat down on the empty side. the side that had been empty 3 years. "It's a good step," she said. Caleb McAllister stood in his own dark yard and looked at a woman sitting on the side of his porch step that he had built for a hope he'd told himself was dead, and he could not speak for a moment, and Ruin climbed up and lay down across her feet, as if he'd done it every night of his life. "I'll take the barn," Caleb said when he could. "You'll have the house. There's a bolt on the inside of the door, and I'll not come near it. We're not married, and I'll not have you sleeping under my roof with your reputation in question. Come morning, I'll drive you to the Parsons if you want it, or drive you back to the train if you don't, and either way I'll have wronged no one." He paused. "That's how it'll be. Honest and above board, same as everything else between us." And Hannah Brooks, sitting on the good step under the mountain stars with a ruined dog across her feet, understood that she was never going back to Millbrook, and that she had known it since 4 words went out under her own hand off her own key, and that the knowing was the least afraid she'd ever been. "The Parsons," she said. "In the morning, if you'll have me." Caleb went very still. "You've been here 2 hours. I've been here a summer. The 2 hours are just my body catching up to my letters." She looked at him steady. "You asked me to come and see the land and the man and the leg. I've seen them. I've seen your dog choose me and your fences run straight and your steps sit empty 3 years because you're as stubborn as I am. What else is there to see, Caleb? What would waiting show me that I don't already know?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "Nothing," he admitted. "Not a thing. Then the Parsons, in the morning." She reached down and scratched Ruin between the ears, and the dog groaned with pleasure, and she smiled the first full smile she'd smiled in longer than she could remember. "Now go sleep in your barn, Mr. McAllister, before you say something clever and ruin it. You've been honest all night. Don't spoil your record." He laughed once more, the sound coming easier now 3 times in one evening after years of silence, and he tipped his hat to her, the way a man tips his hat to something he means to honor, and he went to the barn. And that would have been the end of it, and a good end, the best end either of them had ever hoped for. Except that in the deep of the night, Ruin came up off Hannah's floor snarling, and a orange light was flickering against the window that had no business flickering, and somewhere out in the dark, a man's voice was laughing. Not Caleb's rough, rusty laugh, but a cruel one, a satisfied one, and by the time Hannah got the door open, the whole west fence line was burning. "Caleb!" She was off the porch step and into the yard in her nightdress with Ruin baying beside her, and the fire had already jumped from the fence to the dry grass and was running east toward the barn with the wind behind it. And out beyond the flames, 2 riders were wheeling their horses, and one of them lifted something to his mouth, a bottle, and threw it, and it burst in a sheet of flame against the corner post of the corral. Caleb came out of the barn, already moving, no shirt, no hat. The hickory leg strapped on, crooked in his haste, and he took in the whole of it in one hard glance. The fence, the grass, the barn, in the fire's path, the horses screaming in their stalls, the 2 riders in the dark. "The horses!" he shouted. "Hannah, the horses! The barn, get 'em out! Throw the doors, I'll take the fire. You can't take that fire alone. Get the horses." She went. She did not argue, did not freeze, did not do a single one of the useless things a town-soft woman might have done. She ran for the barn in her bare feet with the dog beside her, and through the doors, and went in among the panicking animals. And she'd handled horses as a girl, and her hands remembered, and she got the lead on the first one, and hauled it out and went back for the next, while behind her, Caleb McAllister fought a grass fire on one leg with a saddle blanket and a shovel, and a rage 4 years in the building, and out in the dark, the 2 riders sat their horses and watched. "That's far enough, McAllister," one of them called the cruel voice the laughing one. "You can't stop it, and you know it. Slade says this is the last friendly warning. Sell the water, or watch it all burn a piece at a time, till there's nothing left worth the deed." Caleb did not answer. Caleb beat at the fire with the blanket and threw dirt and cut a break with the shovel, driving the hickory leg into the soft earth for purchase. And the flames lit his face, orange and furious, and he did not so much as look at the men who'd come to burn him out. Hannah got the last horse clear. Then she saw the shovel, the second one leaning against the barn wall where Caleb kept it. She did not think. She grabbed it, and she ran into the smoke beside him, and she began to cut the brake from the other end, driving the blade into the earth with everything. 11 years of held-down fury had stored up in her, and Caleb saw her there. Saw the telegraph operator from Millbrook, in her nightdress and bare feet, cutting a firebreak beside him in the dark. And something happened in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Get back to the house," he shouted. "Cut your end, I'll cut mine," she shouted back. "We'll meet in the middle. Move, Caleb." And out in the dark, the cruel voice stopped laughing. Because the fire was supposed to run. That was the whole of the plan. Light it and let the wind and the dry grass do the rest, and ride off and let McAllister stand alone and helpless, and watch his life burn and come to Slade in the morning ready to sell. McAllister was not standing helpless. McAllister was cutting a break on one leg with a woman in a nightdress, and between the two of them and the dog dragging burning brush clear in his teeth, and the wind that shifted as wind will as wind did, just enough the break held. The fire caught the cut earth and found nothing to eat and guttered and dropped and died along the line they'd made. And the barn stood and the horses stood safe in the yard, and the west fence was gone, and 40 acres of grass were black and smoking. But the ranch stood. Caleb McAllister leaned on his shovel chest, heaving, streaked with soot and sweat, and looked out into the dark where the two riders sat their horses in stunned silence. "You tell Vernon Slade," he said, and his voice carried across the smoking field flat and clear and utterly without fear, that he sent 2 men and a bottle of coal oil against 1 cripple and a telegraph girl, and the 2 men and the coal oil lost. You tell him that, word for word. The cruel voice found itself again, but it was rattled now, and it showed. "This ain't over, McAllister." "No," Caleb agreed. "It ain't. But it went worse for you tonight than you planned, and you'll have to explain that to Slade, and I don't envy you the telling. Now get off my land before my dog decides your horse looks tastier than the fire did." Ruin on cue loosed a snarl from the dark that would have curdled milk, and the 2 riders wheeled their horses and were gone, and the sound of their hoofbeats faded down the mountain until there was nothing left but the crackle of dying embers, and the 2 of them standing in the ruin of the field. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Hannah Brooks dropped her shovel and turned to Caleb, and he saw that she was shaking now. Now that it was over. Now that it was safe to shake, and he crossed the black ground to her, and she came into his arms, without either of them deciding it, and he held her there in the smoke and the starlight, both of them filthy and scorched and alive. "You cut the brake," he said into her hair, wondering. "You ran into a fire and cut the brake. You said meet in this middle." She was crying now and laughing the 2 things at once, the way he had wept and laughed over a telegram. "So I cut to the middle. That's how it's going to be, isn't it? You cut your end and I cut mine, and we meet in the middle." "Yeah," Caleb McAllister said, and his own voice was not steady, and he did not care. "Yeah, that's exactly how it's going to be." They were married by the Fulton parson at 9 o'clock the next morning. Black-streaked hands and all, because Hannah had refused to wash the soot off first. "I want the parson to see it," she'd said, driving down the mountain beside Caleb with Ruin standing in the wagon bed. "I want it in the record. Married the morning after they burned us, still smelling of the smoke. Let it be written down somewhere that we started on a burned field and got married anyhow. I'm a telegraph operator, Caleb. I believe in the record." The parson, a thin, tired, decent man named Ambrose, who owed Vernon Slade no paper, and was therefore one of the few genuinely free men in Fulton, looked at the 2 of them standing in his little parlor covered in soot, and looked at the dog, and did not ask a single question. "I heard there was a fire on the mountain last night," was all he said. "There was," Caleb said. "Slade's men. I couldn't prove it in a court, and neither could you." "No?" Ambrose opened his book. "No, I don't suppose either of us could." He looked at Hannah. "You know what you're marrying into. Miss the land, the water, the man Slade spent 6 years trying to break. You know all of it." "I know all of it," Hannah said. "He told me himself on the wagon up, the leg and the inquest and the creek. He left nothing out. He's incapable of leaving things out. It took him a whole summer of letters just to work up to keeping one thing back, and he confessed even that inside of 2 minutes when I called him on it. She looked at Caleb, and her sooty face was fierce and certain and unafraid. I'm not marrying a man who's easy to love, Parson. I'm marrying a man who's impossible to lie to. After 11 years reading other people's lies, you can't imagine what a mercy that is. Ambrose looked at her a long moment. Then something in his tired face eased, and he nodded, and he began to read the words. And Caleb McAllister standing in a country parson's parlor with soot on his hands and a stolen leg and a dead man's saw in his memory. And Vernon Slade's whole shadow across his future took the hand of the only woman in the county who'd read him correctly and made his vows in a voice that did not shake, and heard her make hers back in the clear, steady voice she'd learned tapping other people's fates across 90 miles of wire. When it was done, Ambrose closed his book. You'll want to be careful now, he said quietly. Both of you. A man like Slade, when the fire doesn't work, he doesn't stop. He changes tactics. He'll try the water rights in the courts, or the deed, or worse. Fire's the crude tool. When the crude tool fails, men like Slade reach for the law, and the law's the one weapon he's got more of than you do. Let him reach for the law, Hannah said, and something in her voice made both men look at her. The law's made of words, Parson. Deeds and filings and clerk's records and things a man puts his name to. Words carried on wires and written in books. She tucked her arm through her husband's. Words are the one thing on God's earth I know better than Vernon Slade. He's welcome to try me on words. Let him. I've been waiting 11 years for a fight worth having. And Caleb McAllister looked down at his brand new wife, the telegraph girl who'd cut a fire break in her nightdress, and married him in the soot, and just declared war on the richest man in the valley, in a Fulton parlor, before the ink was dry on her own wedding lines, and he understood with a certainty that went all the way to the hickory foot he stood on, that Vernon Slade had made the worst mistake of his life the night he sent 2 men and a bottle of coal oil up that mountain. Because for 4 years, Slade had been fighting one stubborn cripple alone. He was not fighting one anymore. The war Slade got was not the war he'd prepared for. He'd braced for a stubborn man to break slower or faster. He had not braced for a woman who understood better than any lawyer in the territory that every crooked thing a man does leaves a trail of paper behind it, and that the paper can be read. It started 3 days after the wedding, when Hannah McAllister. Now, though, she'd have to say it aloud 100 times before it stopped feeling stolen, sat Caleb down at the plank table with a stub of pencil and a sheet of butcher paper and said, "Tell me everything Vernon Slade has ever put his name to." Caleb looked at her like she'd asked him to recite the Psalms backward. His name to? What do you mean his name to? I mean paper, deeds, contracts, water filings, the Mills coroner report on your leg, the survey he ran on your land without your leave. Every document that exists in this valley with Vernon Slade's signature on the bottom of it. She smoothed the butcher paper flat. A man like Slade doesn't steal with his hands, Caleb. He steals with his pen, and a pen leaves a trail. 11 years on the wire taught me that money moving quiet always leaves a trail, and the trail is always in the paper. And the paper is always somewhere in some clerk's drawer gathering dust because men like Slade think no one will ever bother to read it. And you're going to read it. I'm going to read all of it. She looked up at him. You've been fighting him with your fists and your spite for 4 years, and it's kept you alive, but it hasn't won you anything because fists don't beat a man who owns the coroner. Words beat him. His own words turned back on him, and words are mine. She tapped the pencil on the table. Now, start talking. The survey first. When did he run it? Who ran it? And did anyone sign anything? And Caleb, who had spent 4 years believing the fight was a thing he'd carry alone into the grave, felt the strangest sensation take hold of him. The sensation of not being alone in it. He talked. She wrote. By lamplight that first night, the butcher paper filled with names and dates in her small, even hand, and a shape began to come clear that neither of them had seen before, because Caleb had only ever seen the pieces of it that had cut him, and Hannah was seeing the whole. "Stop," she said an hour in. Her pencil had gone still. "Say that again. The date on the survey." "March. 4 years back. The 8th or 9th, I don't." "And the accident at the mill. Your leg. When exactly?" "January. 2 months before. The 11th. Hannah's face had gone very still the way it had gone still the first time she'd read his notice. "Caleb," she said slowly. "The survey Slade ran on your land without leave, the one that gave him the damn site he wanted, that was March. 2 months after your accident, after the inquest called it operator error and closed the mill's liability." She set the pencil down. "Don't you see it? He took your leg in January to soften you. When that didn't sell you, he sent surveyors in March to just take the water measurement anyhow on the theory that a one-legged man couldn't stop them. You ran them off. You told me that, but the point is the timing. He didn't wait a decent interval. He didn't even wait for you to heal. 2 months off the mill floor, still learning to walk, and he's already back on your land with a survey chain." Her voice dropped. "A jury of valley men. Men who drink off your creek men, who've watched Slade squeeze them too. How do you think they'd feel? Hearing a rich man ran a survey across a crippled neighbor's land 8 weeks after his own mill took the leg." Caleb stared at her. In 4 years, he had never once thought of the two things together. The leg was the leg. The survey was the survey. They were separate wounds, and he'd carried them separately. He had never laid them side by side on a sheet of butcher paper and seen the line that ran between them. "You just—" He started and stopped. In one night you saw a thing I couldn't see in 4 years, because you were inside it." Hannah's voice gentled. "You can't read your own hand, Caleb. Nobody can. It's why you needed someone who reads for a living. That's not weakness, that's just true. I've been reading other people's disasters off the wire for 11 years precisely because I could see them clear when the people inside them couldn't." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You've been fighting blind. You're not blind anymore. That's the whole of what I brought up this mountain, and it's worth more than the acres." And Caleb McAllister turned his rough hand over under hers and held it and did not trust himself to speak. The next morning she went to Fulton. Caleb didn't want her to. They had their first true fight over it. Not the sharp, cruel kind that ends things, but the deep, grinding kind between two stubborn people who've each spent a lifetime being right. "He tried to burn us out," Caleb said, blocking the barn door where she was hitching the wagon. 3 days ago. And you want to drive into Fulton alone, where every third man owes him paper, and start pulling his records out of the courthouse. You'll paint a target on your back. I already have a target on my back. I married you." She kept hitching. "That happened at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning in front of the parson in the record. I can't untarget myself, so I might as well be useful while I'm targeted." "Hannah!" "Caleb!" She stopped and turned, and there was steel in her that he was still learning the dimensions of. "You can't come. That's the plain truth of it, and we both know it. You ride into Fulton, and every man in that town sees the one-legged rancher Slade's feuding with, and they close up like clams and you get nothing. But a woman, a new bride, come down to file her marriage lines proper and register her name all sweetness, asking the clerk innocent little questions about how the water filings work in this territory, because she's just so curious about her new husband's land." She smiled, and it was not entirely a kind smile. "Nobody closes up to that woman. Nobody sees the threat in her. I spent 11 years being invisible behind a telegraph window, Caleb. I know exactly how to be a woman men don't bother to watch. It's the most useful skill I own, and it's about to cost Vernon Slade everything." Caleb looked at her a long moment. "I hate that you're right. You'll get used to it." She climbed up to the seat. "Now move out of the door before I drive over your good foot. And Caleb," her voice softened, "I'll be back by dark. I promise it. If I'm not back by dark, then you come and you bring the dog and you bring the rifle. But I will be back by dark because I have never once in my life not come back when I said I would. Ask Deborah Wills. It's the most reliable thing about me. She was back by dark." She came up the switchback in the last of the light with the wagon and a leather folder on the seat beside her that had not been there in the morning, and Caleb was waiting in the yard the way he'd waited 14 days for a telegram. And when she climbed down, she was pale, and her hands were not quite steady, but her eyes were burning. "Well," he said, "feed me first. I haven't eaten since dawn and I found something, and if I try to tell it hungry, I'll tell it wrong." She pressed the leather folder into his hands. "But hold that. Hold it careful. Because, Caleb, I found the survey filing, the March one. And there's a name on it that isn't Slade's and it isn't a surveyor's. And when I tell you whose it is, you're going to want to ride down that mountain tonight, and I'm going to need you not to." Caleb looked down at the folder in his hands. "Whose name?" "Feed me first." "Hannah. Whose name?" She looked at him, and the burning in her eyes banked down to something harder and colder. "Judge Amos Caro," she said. "The circuit judge. The one who rides through and hears the land cases and the water disputes for the whole territory. The man who'd sit the bench if this ever came to a real trial." She let it land. "His name is on Slade's survey, Caleb, as a witness. Notarized. 4 years ago. Which means the judge who'd decide whether Slade gets your water has already 4 years back put his own signature on Slade's illegal survey of your land." Her voice was very quiet now. "The fight isn't you against Slade. It never was. It's you against Slade and the man who'd judge you. That's why you could never win it with fists. The bench was bought before you ever threw the first punch." The yard went silent except for the wind coming down off the ridge, and Ruin whined low, sensing the change in the two of them, and Caleb McAllister stood holding a leather folder that contained the reason 4 years of fighting had gotten him exactly nowhere. "So it's hopeless," he said. Not a question. A man taking the measure of a thing. "No!" Hannah's answer came fast and hard. "No, Caleb. It's the opposite of hopeless. Don't you understand? For 4 years you couldn't win because you couldn't see the whole board. Now you can see it. The judge is bought fine. Now we know the judge is bought, and we can plan for a bought judge instead of walking into his court like a lamb. A trap you can see isn't a trap anymore. It's just a fact you work around." She took the folder back from his numb hands, gentle. "Now feed me, and then we're going to figure out how you beat a rich man and a crooked judge at the same time. And I already have the beginning of an idea, and it's going to require me to do the one thing I swore I'd never do again in my life." "What's that?" Hannah McAllister looked up the mountain toward the dark ridge, and something crossed her face that Caleb couldn't read the first thing about her. He hadn't been able to read since the moment she stepped off the train. "Go back to the wire," she said. "Not Millbrooks. Somewhere higher. Somewhere the message doesn't stop at a valley Slade owns." She met his eyes. "There's one man in this territory who outranks a bought circuit judge, and I know how to reach him because I've been putting his messages on the wire for 11 years without ever once daring to send one of my own. And now I'm going to send him one of my own." She would not tell him the name that night. She was too tired, and the plan was too raw, and she'd learned long ago never to speak a plan aloud before it was ready, because a plan spoken too soon has a way of talking itself out of existence. So they ate and she slept, and in the gray before dawn, Caleb woke to find her already at the plank table with the leather folder open and the butcher paper covered in a new and denser web of names and dates and lines connecting them. And he stood in the doorway a moment, just watching her work. His wife of 5 days bent over her papers by lamplight more alive than any woman he'd ever seen waging a war with a pencil. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "I am. Stare later. Come look at this." She jabbed the pencil at the paper. I sat up thinking. Slade's whole scheme rests on 3 legs, same as a stool. The first leg is money. He's rich, he can outspend you and outweight you. Can't fight that. He'll always have more money. The second leg is the Judge Caro's bought, so the local court's rigged. Can't fight that either, not in Caro's own court. But the third leg, she tapped hard. The third leg is that nobody's watching. That's the whole thing, Caleb. Everything Slade's done, he's done in the dark. The loose saw guard nobody would testify to. The survey run when a crippled man couldn't stop it. The fire in the middle of the night with two men who thought no one but you would ever see. His whole power rests on nobody outside this valley ever looking too close. She looked up and her eyes were fierce. So we take away the third leg. We make somebody watch, somebody higher than Caro, somebody Slade's money can't reach and Caro's bench can't overrule. And the stool falls over. The man higher than Caro. The Federal Land Office. Hannah said it quietly like a card laid face up. The creek's an interstate water source. Caleb, it crosses a territorial line up on the high ridge before it drops into the valley, doesn't it? You told me. North of your high fence. Caleb went still. It does. Crosses into the next territory for maybe a quarter mile before it comes back down onto my land. Then it's not a valley matter. It's not even a territorial matter. Water that crosses a territorial line falls under the Federal Land Office and the U.S. Commissioner, and no circuit judge, bought or honest, has jurisdiction over federal water. Caro can't touch it. Slade's money can't reach a federal commissioner in the capital who's never heard either of their names. She sat back. For 6 years, Slade's fought you like it's a valley fight, because in a valley fight, he holds every card. But it was never a valley fight. It's a federal fight. He just prayed you'd never figure that out, because the day you did, all his money and his bought judge stopped being worth a plugged nickel. She smiled that hard smile. And you never would have figured it out. Not in 100 years. Because you were fighting with your fists and your spite, and this was never a thing fists could reach. It needed somebody who'd spent 11 years learning exactly which wire a message travels down to land on the right desk in the Capitol. It needed me. Caleb sat down slowly across from her. You've been my wife 5 days, he said. And you've already found the one thing that could end it. The thing I couldn't find in 6 years. I've been your wife 5 days, Hannah said, and I've been the woman who reads the wire for 11 years. Slade fought Caleb McAllister for 6 years and won. He's about to find out that when he burned that fence 3 nights ago, he wasn't fighting Caleb McAllister anymore. He was fighting Caleb McAllister in the telegraph. She stood and gathered the papers, and her hands were steady now, all the tiredness burned off. Hitch the wagon, not to Fulton this time. Fulton's wire runs through Slade's Valley, and I won't trust a word to it. We're going to the junction, the rail junction 2 towns over, where the federal wire runs straight to the Capitol and doesn't touch a single mile of Slade's country. She looked at him. I'm going to send a message to the U.S. Land Commissioner requesting a federal survey of an interstate water source. And I'm going to sign it. And once that message is on the federal wire, Vernon Slade cannot stop it, cannot buy it, and cannot burn it. It'll be in the Capitol by nightfall. And then Caleb. Then we wait for the one thing Slade spent 6 years making sure never happened. We wait for somebody to come and look. Pakaki. They did not make it to the junction unwatched. They were an hour down the mountain out onto the valley road, where it ran flat and open, past the edge of Slade's grazing land, when 3 riders came out of a stand of cottonwood ahead and spread across the road, and the middle one held up a hand, and Caleb reined in the wagon, and Hannah felt her heart go up into her throat and stay there. The middle rider was not one of the fire starters. This was a bigger man, older, heavier, with a good coat and a good horse, and the soft, unhurried manner of a man who has never in his life had to hurry for anyone. It was the first time Hannah had laid eyes on him, but she knew him before he opened his mouth. She'd known him for 6 months off the wire from the shape of the thing he'd built. Vernon Slade, she said. The big man's eyes moved to her, mild and curious, and he touched his hat brim with a courtesy that was worse than any threat. Mrs. McAllister. I don't believe we've been introduced, though. I confess I've been curious about you. The telegraph girl from Millbrook, who answered a cripple's notice. He said cripple the way another man might say, dear friend, gently, almost fondly, and it was the cruelest thing Hannah had ever heard, that gentleness. I've been hearing the most remarkable things. That you drove into Fulton yesterday and spent 3 hours in the county clerk's office. That you asked a great many questions about water filings. That you left with a folder." He smiled. "You've been busy for a bride of 5 days." Caleb's hand had moved slow toward the rifle under the wagon seat, and Slade's eyes flicked to it amused. "I wouldn't, Caleb, truly. There are 3 of us, and you're a poor shot on your best day, and this isn't that. I didn't ride out here for gunplay. I rode out to talk to your wife since she seems to be the one making the decisions now, and I'll say this for you, you married up. Considerably up. She's found more of my business in 1 day at a clerk's desk than you found in 6 years of glaring at me across the valley." He turned back to Hannah, and the amusement drained out of his face, and what was left underneath was flat and cold and patient as a snake. "Which is exactly why I'm here. You're a clever woman, Mrs. McAllister. Clever enough, I'd wager, to have already worked out that Amos Caro's name is on my survey. Clever enough to be thinking about jurisdictions right now. Clever enough maybe to be driving toward a certain rail junction with a certain message you'd rather not send from Fulton." The road went very quiet. Hannah did not let a single thing show on her face. 11 years behind a telegraph window had made her the best card player in 3 counties, and she played the best hand of her life sitting on a wagon seat with a coal oil arsonist smiling at her. "You've had someone watching us," she said flat. "I have people everywhere, Mrs. McAllister. It's what money buys. Not loyalty. Loyalty's expensive and unreliable. Just eyes. Cheap, plentiful eyes." Slade shifted in his saddle. "So let me save us all a great deal of unpleasantness. I know what you've figured out. I know where you're driving. And I'm going to offer you something I've never offered your husband in 6 years, because your husband is a stubborn fool, and you are not." He leaned forward. "I'll buy the water rights at 10 times the land's value. 10 times. Enough that you and Caleb take that money and go anywhere in this country, and live like decent people, the rest of your lives far from this valley, far from me, and never think of Vernon Slade again. A clean, rich, quiet life. All you have to do is turn this wagon around, hand me that folder, and never send that message." He spread his hands, reasonable, generous. "Or you can drive on to the junction and send it, and find out what happens to people who make me spend money and eyes and worry. I've taken a leg in this valley, Mrs. McAllister. Don't imagine I'd stop at a leg." It was Hannah understood a genuinely good offer. 10 times the value. A rich life somewhere clean and far. She thought of Deborah Wills and the boarding house and the safe gray years. She thought of a life with Caleb where they never had to be afraid. And she thought of the loose saw guard and the 2 men who wouldn't testify because they had children, and the boy Tommy Rourke, who'd given his lunch to hungrier children through a whole hard winter and been called soft for it. "That's a great deal of money," Hannah said. "It is. More money than my husband and I would ever see otherwise. Considerably more. And all we'd have to do is let you have the water." She nodded slowly, as if turning it over. "The water that half the valley drinks off. The water every small farmer downstream needs to keep his land alive. Once you own it outright with no upstream owner to say no, you can damn it sell it, price it however you please. Every farmer in this valley would drink at your say-so and pay what you named or watch his fields die." She tilted her head. "That's what I'd be selling, isn't it, Mr. Slade? Not just our creek, their throats. Every family in that valley's throat in your hand forever." Slade's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and knowing. "You're going to tell me you can't do that to them," he said. "You're going to give me a speech about the small farmers. How noble." "No." Hannah's answer was quiet, and it landed like a slap. "I'm not going to give you a speech. I spent 11 years reading other people's disasters off a wire and keeping my mouth shut, and I've got no speeches left in me. I'm just going to tell you a fact. Mr. Slade, one fact, and then you can decide what to do with it." She looked him dead in the eye. "The message is already sent." The valley road went utterly silent. "You're lying," Slade said. "I sent it yesterday, from Fulton." She never blinked. "You had eyes on me in the clerk's office. You had eyes on the folder. What you didn't have eyes on was the 10 minutes I spent in the back room of the Fulton Depot where the through wire runs, talking to a night operator named Pell, who owes you no paper because he's federal, not county, and federal operators can't be bought by a man who doesn't hold their contract. The message to the U.S. Land Commissioner, requesting a federal survey of an interstate water source, went out yesterday afternoon over the federal wire under my own name, and it was in the Capitol by nightfall. She let it sink in. This drive today? This is theater, Mr. Slade. I'm not going to the junction to send anything. I already sent it. I'm going to the junction to meet the reply, which was waiting for me this morning when a rider brought it up from the depot, and which I have read, and which is in this folder. She patted the leather. You want to know what it says? A federal surveyor is already on the train. He'll be here inside a week. And when a federal surveyor stands on that high ridge and sees a creek crossing a territorial line, Amos Caro's signature stops mattering, and your money stops mattering, and 6 years of everything you built in the dark comes out into the daylight, where a federal commissioner can read it, same as I did. She had gambled everything on the bluff, because it was a bluff, half a bluff. She had sent the message that part was true. She'd sent it from Fulton exactly as she'd said, having realized the moment she saw the folder that she'd never make it to the junction unwatched, and having done the smart thing. The invisible woman thing, the thing Slade never saw coming, because he was watching the folder and not the woman. But there'd been no reply yet. The reply wasn't in the folder. The folder held the survey records and nothing more. She was betting her life and Caleb's that Vernon Slade could not tell a true card from a bluffed one across a wagon's width of road. And Vernon Slade, who had bought a coroner and a judge, and half a town, who had taken a man's leg, and slept fine, after who had never in 6 years met a McAllister. He couldn't read, looked at the woman on the wagon seat with her steady hands and her steady eyes, and her flat, unhurried voice, and for the first time in 6 years, Vernon Slade could not tell. The silence stretched. A long 5 seconds. 10. You're bluffing, he said. But it came out a half-second too slow, and they both heard it, and in that half-second, Hannah McAllister knew she had won the hand. Then call it, she said softly. Ride to Fulton right now and wire the Capitol and ask whether a survey request came in from an H. McAllister yesterday afternoon. It'll take you 2 hours to get your answer, and by then I'll have driven to the junction and back and told 40 people what I told you, and it won't matter what the wire says because the whole valley will know the federal government is coming to look at Vernon Slade's water. The looking is the thing, Mr. Slade. You said it yourself 6 years ago. When you took my husband's leg in the dark was always the point. Well, she gathered the reins. The dark's over. Now move your men out of the road or drive over them. Caleb, I don't care which, but we're going to the junction and we're going to be back by dark because I have never once in my life not come back when I said I would. For a long, long moment, nobody moved. Then Vernon Slade, rich, patient, cruel. Vernon Slade, who had never once had to hurry for anyone, did the arithmetic behind his cold, flat eyes and could not make the numbers come out safe and slowly reined his horse aside. Let them pass, he said to his men, and as the wagon rolled through the gap, Slade leaned in one last time and dropped his voice so only Hannah could hear it, and the mildness was gone entirely, now stripped down to the thing underneath. Whether you're bluffing or not, he murmured, you've made yourself a promise you can't keep, Mrs. McAllister. A federal surveyor a week out is a week of nights, and I own the nights in this valley. Ask your husband about his leg. Ask him what a week of Vernon Slade's nights can do. He straightened and touched his hat, gentle and courteous and terrible. Get home before dark, truly. I'd hate for anything to happen on the road. Then he was gone, riding easy back toward his cottonwoods, and Caleb shook the reins, and the wagon rolled on toward the junction, and neither of them said a word for a full mile. Finally, Caleb spoke low, not looking at her, his voice rough with something that was half awe and half terror. Was any of it true? The reply. The surveyor on the train. The message is true. I sent it yesterday from the federal wire exactly as I said. That part's iron. Hannah's hands were shaking now badly now that Slade was out of sight and it was safe to shake. The reply there is no reply yet. I bluffed the reply. There's nothing in this folder but the clerk's records. She pressed the trembling hands flat against her knees. But it doesn't matter now, Caleb, don't you see? It doesn't matter whether the replies come. Because I told him it had, and I told him I'd tell the whole valley, and now the only way for him to prove me a liar is to admit out loud that he's terrified of a federal surveyor, which tells everyone he's got something to hide. I've trapped him in his own dark. Either the surveyor's coming in, which case he's finished, or I lied about the surveyor, in which case he still has to explain to the whole valley why a lie about a federal survey put the fear of God in Vernon Slade. She let out a breath that shook. I made his secrecy into the weapon. His whole power was that nobody looked, so I made looking inevitable whether anyone actually looks or not. That's the thing about a man who rules by the dark, Caleb. The very second somebody isn't afraid of the dark anymore, it stops working. Caleb drove in silence for another quarter-mile, absorbing it. You planned all of that, he said. The Fulton wire, the federal operator, the bluff on the road. You planned it before you even hitched the wagon this morning, didn't you? You knew he'd have eyes, and you knew he'd stop us, and you had the whole thing loaded before you climbed up on this seat. I hoped he'd stop us. Hannah almost laughed, and the laugh came out shaky. If he hadn't, I'd have wasted a perfectly good bluff. But yes, I planned it. I've been planning some version of it since the night I read his name next to the judge's. A man who reads the wire 11 years learns to have the message ready before the key ever clicks. She turned to look at him, pale and shaking, and burning-eyed, and entirely ferociously alive. But Caleb, he wasn't bluffing at the end. That last part he said to me. About the nights. About your leg. That was the one true thing he said the whole time, and it means the same thing your loose saw guard meant 4 years ago. Her voice dropped. We have a week, maybe, before a surveyor comes and it's finally out of the dark and into the light where he can't reach it. And Vernon Slade just promised me to my face that he owns every one of those nights in between. Caleb McAllister's hands tightened on the reins, and up ahead, the rail junction came into view against the flat, bright afternoon. And behind them, the mountain rose green and gold with the ranch and the barn and the wide porch step waiting on it. Everything they had. Everything Slade wanted. Everything that would have to be defended through a week of Vernon Slade's nights. Then we don't waste the week, Caleb said, and his voice had gone flat and hard, and certain the voice of a man who had built a life out of spite on one leg and was not about to lose it now. We send your message that's already sent from the junction too, to be sure. And then we go home. And we get ready. Because I've survived one of that man's nights before Hannah. I've got the hickory leg to prove it. He looked at her, and there was something in his weathered face she'd never seen there. Not spite, not stubbornness, but a fierce and settled joy, terrible and bright. But he made a mistake, same as he did the night of the fire. 4 years ago, he came at one man in the dark. This week he's coming at 2, and this time we'll be the ones who see him coming. Getting ready took the rest of that day and most of the next, and it did not look the way Caleb had imagined a war looked. He'd imagined guns. He'd cleaned the rifle and the old shotgun and laid out shells on the plank table, because a man defends his land with what he has, and what Caleb had was a strong right arm and a poor aim, and a mountain he knew better than any man alive. But Hannah barely looked at the guns. Put those away where they're handy, but not where a window shows them, she said, bent over the butcher paper again. We may need them, and I pray we don't, because the second a gun goes off, Caleb Slade wins. Wins how man's trying to burn us out. Because the moment there's a shooting, it stops being a story about a rich man persecuting a crippled neighbor and his bride, and starts being a story about a range feud with dead men on both sides. And a range feud Amos Caro can hear. A range feud's a local matter for a local judge, and the local judge is bought. She looked up. Slade would love it if you shot one of his men. He'd love it more than winning outright, because a dead Slade rider gives Caro the excuse to hang you legal, and then he takes the water off your widow for pennies. Don't you see, he's not just trying to burn the ranch. He's trying to make you fight him the one way he can still win, with violence in the dark, where it's your word against his money." She set down the pencil. "So we don't give it to him. We survive his nights without firing a shot, and we keep it a story about an honest family and a thief, and we hold on till the daylight comes and the surveyor with it. That's the whole battle, Caleb. Not to beat him, just to still be standing and still be in the right when the looking finally happens." Caleb sat with that a while. "You're telling me to let him hit us and not hit back. I'm telling you to make him miss. There's a difference, and it's everything." She pulled the butcher paper toward him and turned it so he could see. She'd drawn the ranch, the barn, the house, the well, the fence lines, the switchback road up, and the mountain behind. "You know this land better than any man alive, so teach it to me. Every way onto this property, every place a man could come from in the dark, every place a fire would run, and every place it'd die. Show me the ground, Caleb, the way you'd show a fence line, and let's make it so that whatever Slade throws at us, the ground catches it before we have to." And Caleb McAllister looked at his wife of 6 days, turning his war into a survey, and understood again that he had married the one mind in the territory that could beat Vernon Slade, and that the mind had come up his mountain in a blue dress and cut a fire break in her nightdress, and never once, not for a single hour, considered running. He showed her the ground. The first night Slade did nothing, and the nothing was worse than anything. They sat up in the dark with the lamp out. Hannah had insisted on the lamp out. No light to shoot at or aim by. And they listened to the mountain, and Ruin lay by the door with his ears working, and nothing came. No riders, no fire, no cruel laughing voice out beyond the fence. Just the wind off the ridge and the creak of the house and the long crawl of the hours. "He's waiting," Hannah whispered sometime past midnight. "He wants us tired. He wants us to sit up 3-4 nights running with our nerves stretched to breaking, and then hit us on the night we finally can't keep our eyes open. It's what I'd do. Fear does more work than fire if you're patient, and Slade's got nothing but patience. So what do? We sleep in shifts, starting now. You first, you've got the leg to favor, and you've been up since dawn, and I need you strong for whatever's coming, not worn to nothing by nerves." She pressed him back gently when he started to argue. "Caleb, I've sat up 11 years of night shifts on the wire. I can do dark and quiet, and waiting better than any soul alive. It's the one thing I'm trained for down to my bones. Let me take the first watch. I'll wake you at 3, and you take it to dawn, and we'll both have slept, and we'll both be sharp, and that's how you beat a man who's counting on you being tired." She looked at him in the dark. "Trust me to hold the watch. You trusted me with the whole war. Trust me with 3 hours of it." He trusted her. He slept. And Hannah McAllister sat the first watch of her marriage in the dark by the door, with the dog's head in her lap, and her husband breathing slow in the next room, and she was not afraid, and she watched the mountain, and somewhere out in Slade's dark, she knew a rich man was waiting for her to break. He was going to be waiting a long time. The second night they came, not with fire. Slade had learned from the fire, learned that the McAllisters would fight it, that the woman would cut a break in her nightclothes, that fire on open ground could be beaten by 2 determined people who saw it coming. So the second night, Slade sent men to do the thing that fire couldn't, the thing that would break Caleb McAllister without a single flame. They came for the water. Ruin heard them first, came up off the floor with a low growl an hour before dawn, and Caleb, who had the watch, was at the window in an instant. And he saw them, not by the house, not by the barn, but up high, moving along the base of the ridge, toward the place where the creek came down onto his land. 3 men with picks and shovels, and a keg between 2 of them, and Caleb's blood ran cold, because he knew what the keg was, and he knew what the picks were for, and he understood in one sick lurch exactly what Slade meant to do. "Hannah." He shook her awake hard, his voice low and urgent. "Get up. They're not here for the buildings. They're going for the creek, up at the head where it comes onto the land. They mean to blow the channel." She was awake, and on her feet in a heartbeat. "Blow it how? Blow it to do what? Divert it. Caleb was already pulling his boot the one and strapping the hickory on with hands that shook only a little. There's a low saddle in the rock up there west of where the creek crosses. Always has been. If a man set a charge right and broke the east bank, the whole creek'd spill west through that saddle and drop off the far side of the ridge into the next drainage away from my land, away from the whole valley. Gone. His face was gray in the dark. And here's the devil of it, Hannah. If the water leaves my land before the federal surveyor comes, then there's nothing to survey. No interstate water crossing my property because the water's not on my property anymore. Slade doesn't need to own the creek if he can just move it. Make it so the thing you called the feds about doesn't exist by the time they get here. Hannah went white. He's not trying to take the water, she breathed. He's trying to make it disappear before it can be looked at. My whole plan, the federal survey, the interstate crossing, all of it, it all rests on that creek being where it is. If he moves it, I've got nothing. I called the government out to survey a creek that won't be there. That's the size of it. Then we have to stop them. She was already reaching for her shoes. Right now, tonight, before they set that charge. Caleb, I know. He caught her arm. Listen to me. Listen. That's a mile of hard climbing up rough ground in the dark, and I go slow on this leg over broken rock, slower than you know. It's the one place the leg truly costs me. And there's 3 of them, and they've got a head start. And if we're not up there before they set that keg, it won't matter that we came. He gripped her arm hard. So we can't both go slow. You're faster than me over that ground, and there's no shame in the saying of it. You go ahead. You go now fast as you can, and you don't try to fight them. You just get where they can see you, and you make noise, and you tell them the federal surveyor is already on the ridge, come to watch the water, because a man setting an illegal charge does not want a federal witness, and the fear of it might freeze them long enough for me to catch up. Buy me the minutes. That's all. Buy me the minutes with your voice, same as you bought them on the road, and I'll bring the rest. For 1 second, Hannah hesitated 1 second, at the thought of going up that dark mountain alone, toward 3 men with a powder keg. Then she thought of the loose saw guard, and the survey run 8 weeks after they took his leg, and every family in the valley whose throat Slade wanted in his hand, and the second passed. Bring the rifle, she said. Not to shoot, to be seen carrying. A man thinks twice about a woman he can't scare when there might be a rifle coming up behind her. She was at the door. I'll buy you the minutes, Caleb. I've never once not come back when I said I would, and I'm not starting on the night it counts most. Come up as fast as the leg lets you. I'll be talking when you get there. And she was gone into the dark, running up the mountain. Her husband had taught her, like a fence line, toward 3 men and a keg of powder, with nothing in her hands, and 11 years of learned steadiness in her voice. She heard them before she saw them. The chink of a pick on rock, low voices, the scrape of the keg being set. And she stopped still hidden in the dark below them, and she made herself breathe slow, and she thought not fear. They win with fear. Give them mine and I've lost. So give them something else. She stepped out where the starlight would show her, and she pitched her voice to carry flat and clear and utterly unhurried the voice she'd used to send 1,000 men's fates down the wire without once letting the wire hear her tremble. I wouldn't set that charge, boys. 3 heads snapped up. A pick clattered. One of the men, she recognized the cruel voice from the fire, swore, and reached for something at his belt. That's far enough, missus. You come up here alone in the dark, you're a bigger fool than the federal surveyors on the ridge. She said it into the middle of his sentence, calm as a stone, and it stopped him cold. Came in on the evening train, rode up the back of the mountain this afternoon while you were all watching the front. He's camped on the high rock right now, not 400 yards from where you're standing, and he's got a glass and he's watching the water. Because that's what a federal surveyor does. He watches the water. That's his whole job. She let it land. So you go on and set your charge. Blow the creek out of its bed with a federal witness watching you do it through a spyglass. And when they hang the 3 of you for destroying an interstate water source under federal protection, not Slade, not Caro, the 3 of you, because Slade's name's not on that keg. Yours are the only faces up here tonight You make sure to tell the federal marshal that Vernon Slade sent you. See how much good his money does you at a federal gallows." It was a bluff. There was no surveyor on the ridge. There was only a one-legged man climbing hard through the dark somewhere below her, and a rifle he'd carry, but never fire. But it was the exact right bluff, because it did not ask these three men to be brave or loyal or anything but afraid. And fear was the one thing Slade had trained them to feel, and now she turned it and pointed it back up the hill at the man who'd planted it in them. "He's lying," one of them said. "There ain't nobody up there. She come up alone." "Then walk up and look." Hannah didn't move. 400 yards. "Go on. Walk up onto that high rock and see if there's a federal camp on it. And while you're gone, your two friends can set the charge. And if I'm right, the man up there gets a real good look at exactly which two of you did it. Somebody's face is going to be the one the surveyor remembers. Which of you wants it to be his?" The three men looked at each other. And that was the crack she needed, that half-second of three men, each not wanting to be the face that hanged, and into that crack at the worst possible moment for Vernon. Slade came the sound of a man climbing up out of the dark below, slow and heavy and deliberate, the drag and plant of a hickory leg on broken rock, and the metallic sound unmistakable in the still night of a rifle lever working a shell into the chamber. "Ms. McAllister giving you gentlemen the news." Caleb's voice came up out of the black, rough and calm and terrible. "'Cause she's got it right. There's a federal man on the ridge, and there's me down here, and there's a rifle, and there's exactly one way this ends with all three of you riding home breathing. You want to hear it, or you want to find out the other way?" He came up level with Hannah out of the dark and stood beside her, a one-legged rancher and a telegraph girl, a rifle held plain across his chest, the pair of them facing down three armed men and a keg of powder in the hour before dawn, and Vernon Slade's three hired hands who had come up that mountain, certain of the dark and certain of the fear, found the dark full of federal witnesses, and the fear pointing the wrong way, and did the arithmetic same as Slade had done it on the road, and could not make it come out safe. "Leave the keg," Caleb said. "Leave the picks. Get on your horses and ride down and tell Vernon Slade that his water's still where God put it, and there's a federal surveyor watching it, and the next man he sends up here is going to hang for a thief and a saboteur, while Slade sits home clean, same as he did when he took my leg. Tell him the dark's not his anymore." He tipped the rifle barrel just slightly toward the switchback. "Go on, ride." They rode. They left the keg and the picks and the shovels, and they went down the mountain in the dark, and the drum of their hooves faded, and Caleb McAllister and his wife stood alone on the high ground beside a powder keg that had almost erased everything, and for a moment neither could speak. Then Hannah's knees gave just slightly, and Caleb caught her one arm hard around her, the rifle in his other hand, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and shook. "There's no surveyor on the ridge," she whispered. "Caleb, there's nobody up there. I made it up. I made all of it up again, and they believed it again. I know." "What if they'd walked up to look?" "They didn't." He held her. "They didn't, because you gave them a reason to be more scared of walking up than of riding off. And that's the whole trick of it. And you did it twice now, once on the road, and once on this mountain with nothing in your hands but your own steady voice." He pulled back just enough to look at her in the starlight, and his weathered face was full of something too big to name. 4 years I fought that man with my fists and lost every round. You've beaten him twice in a week with words you made up on the spot. I keep thinking I've taken the measure of you, Hannah, and every day you turn out to be bigger than I figured." She laughed, shaky and wet against his shoulder. "It's not bigger. It's just the one thing I know. I read men. I've read frightened men my whole life off the wire. The ones wiring for money, they'll never repay the ones running from something. I know what a frightened man will believe, because a frightened man will believe anything that gives him a way out. Slade trained those three to be frightened, and I just handed them the exit." She wiped her face. "But Caleb, it won't hold. That's twice I've bluffed a surveyor onto that ridge, and there's no surveyor, and Slade's going to work that out. He's going to send those three back down, and he's going to ask them real careful. Did you see the federal man? And they're going to have to say no, We didn't see him. We just heard the missus say he was there. And Slade's no fool. He'll know I've been bluffing. And then the real one had better show up," Caleb said grimly, "before Slade calls the bluff for good." The real one did not show up the next day, nor the day after. And Vernon Slade, exactly as Hannah had feared, worked it out. They knew he'd worked it out because on the fourth day in broad daylight, no dark now, no keg, no hired men, Vernon Slade himself rode up the switchback alone, easy in his good coat, on his good horse, and reined in at the edge of the yard where Caleb stood with the rifle, and Hannah stood beside him, and Ruin stood between them with every hair on his back standing up. "Mrs. McAllister." Slade touched his hat, mild as ever, but there was a new thing under the mildness, now a satisfaction, the look of a man who's finally read a card that's been face down too long. "I'll come straight to it since we're all busy people. There's no federal surveyor on that ridge. There never was. My men were up and down that high rock this morning, and there's not a boot print on it that isn't theirs. You've been bluffing me, ma'am. Twice. A very good bluff. I'll pay you the compliment. It froze better men than these, but a bluff and bluffs run out." He folded his hands on the saddle horn. "I sent to the Capitol myself. Wired the land office direct. And do you know what they told me?" Hannah's face did not move, but Caleb, close beside her, felt her go very still, and he understood that this was the moment the whole week had been racing toward, and that his wife did not know what came next any better than he did. "They told me," Slade went on, gently savoring it, "that a request did come in, from an H. McAllister, 6 days ago." His smile widened. "And they told me it's been logged and filed and placed in the queue. The queue, Mrs. McAllister. Do you know how long the queue is at the Federal Land Office? A survey request for a minor interstate water source in a territory nobody in the Capitol's ever heard of." He let it hang. "Months. It could be months. It could be next spring before a federal surveyor ever climbs that ridge, if he ever does at all. You didn't call down the government on me, ma'am. You mailed a letter into a very deep drawer." He gathered his reins. "So here's where we are. There's no surveyor coming, not for months, and I own every night between now and whenever he does. You've got a strong bluff and a stubborn husband and a good dog, and I've got money and time and eyes and the whole valley owing me paper. And I can wait. I've always been able to wait." He looked at them almost kindly. "The offer's off the table now, by the way. The 10 times value that was for a clever woman who might have been clever enough to take it. You weren't. So now there's no offer. Now there's just the waiting, and I'm better at it than you, and we both know how this ends. I only rode up to tell you so face to face like a gentleman. I'll see you at the foreclosure, Caleb. Give my regards to your leg." He turned his horse, and Hannah McAllister spoke, and her voice was not the bluffing voice, and it stopped Vernon Slade cold, with his horse half turned. "You wired the land office direct," she said. "You, by name, to ask about my request." Slade paused. "I did, under your own name, Vernon Slade, to the United States Federal Land Office. You put on the record, the federal record, the one your money can't reach, and Caro can't touch a wire from Vernon Slade, specifically inquiring about the status of a federal survey request concerning water that crosses your neighbor's land." She took one step forward, and now there was something burning in her, something that had been banking for 4 days, waiting for exactly this. "Do you know what a federal clerk does, Mr. Slade, when a private citizen wires to ask real anxious about the status of a survey? He's got no legal standing to inquire about a survey concerning land he doesn't own." Her voice dropped. "He notes it. He notes it in the file. Because a man asking after a survey that badly is a man with a reason to fear it, and federal clerks are trained, I know, because I've spent 11 years being the wire they train to note exactly that kind of interest. You didn't find out my request was buried in a drawer, Mr. Slade. You dug it back out of the drawer. You put your own name on it. You told the federal government in writing over a wire, even I can't unsend that Vernon Slade is afraid of what a surveyor might find on that creek." She smiled, and it was the hardest, coldest, most joyful smile Caleb had ever seen on her. A request from an H. McAllister might sit in a queue for months, but an inquiry from the interested party from the rich neighbor who's not supposed to care that gets a survey moved to the front of the line. You didn't bury my letter, Vernon. You just signed your name to the thing that pulls it out of the drawer. You did in one anxious wire what I couldn't have done in a year of waiting. You called the surveyor down on yourself. The yard went utterly silent. Vernon Slade sat his horse and the mild satisfaction drained out of his face, drop by drop, as he did the arithmetic. The arithmetic he could not make come out safe, could not make come out anything, but exactly what she'd said. And for the first time in 6 years, the first time in the whole long war, Vernon Slade looked afraid. "You're bluffing," he said, but it was hollow now and old, and it convinced no one, least of all himself. "Maybe," Hannah said softly. "I've bluffed you twice this week, and you know it, so maybe I'm bluffing a third time. Or maybe I spent 11 years on the inside of exactly the kind of office you just wired, and I know precisely what happens to a file when the guilty party can't keep his hands off it. You want to find out which—" She tucked her arm through Caleb's. "You wired them once, Mr. Slade. Wire them again. Ask them now today whether that request's still at the back of the queue or whether a certain inquiry from a certain interested party bumped it clear to the front. Go on. You've got the wire. You've got the money. Ask." She held his eyes. "And whatever they tell you, remember that you're the one who moved it. Not me. You. You beat yourself, Vernon, the day you couldn't stand not knowing. The day the dark stopped being enough for you, and you had to step into the light and ask." For a long, long moment, Vernon Slade did not move, and the whole war hung in the balance of a rich man's face. Then, without another word, he wheeled his horse and rode down the mountain fast, faster than a man rides who's got all the time in the world. Fast. In fact, like a man in a sudden and terrible hurry. And Caleb McAllister watched the richest man in the valley flee his own foreclosure threat down the switchback at a gallop and turn to his wife and could barely find his voice. "Was that one true?" he asked. The clerk noting his name. The survey getting bumped. Any of it. Hannah watched Slade's dust settle on the road below, and she was quiet a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. "It might be. Federal clerks do note interested parties, that part's true. I've done it myself. Whether it bumps his file to the front, whether the surveyor's a month out or a year, I truly don't know, Caleb. I made the certainty up. Same as the ridge." She let out a long breath. "But look at him ride. Look at him." Slade was a small fleeing shape on the valley road now. A man who was sure I was bluffing doesn't ride like that. He rides like a man who just realized he can't be sure anymore that he handed me a real weapon when he wired his own name in, and now he's got to find out how sharp it is, and the finding out is going to eat him alive. She turned to Caleb, pale and spent and burning. "I don't know if I beat him, but I know he's not sure he beat me, and for a man like Slade, who's been sure of everything for 6 years, that not being sure is going to cost him more sleep than it costs us. The dark was always his. I just gave him a taste of what it's like to lie awake in it wondering. Let's see how he likes his own medicine." And down in the valley, riding hard for the federal wire to ask a question he was suddenly desperate and terrified to have answered, Vernon Slade discovered that he did not like it at all. Slade did not like his own medicine, and he could not stop swallowing it. That was the thing Hannah had understood, and he had not, that a man who's ruled by certainty for 6 years has no muscle for doubt, no callous against it, and the first real doubt goes into him like a fever. He wired the land office again. Of course he did. He couldn't not. And the answer he got back was the worst possible kind, because it was no answer at all. The clerk confirmed only that the McAllister request was logged, that an inquiry from a V. Slade had been received and noted in the file, and that the matter was under review. Under review. 2 words, and Vernon Slade read them the way Hannah had taught him to read them, and he could not sleep. Because under review might mean buried, or it might mean his own anxious wire had done exactly what she'd said. Flagged the file. Moved it. put his name on the record as the frightened guilty party. He didn't know, and not knowing for Vernon Slade was a thing he'd spent his whole life buying his way out of, and here at last was a thing his money couldn't buy him out of, because the not knowing lived in a federal drawer 800 miles away where his money had no reach. He'll do something rash now, Hannah told Caleb the morning after Slade's second wire. She knew about the second wire, the way she knew most things, the Fulton Depot operator, the free one Pell had sent word up the mountain with Tommy Rourke. A patient man who loses his patience is more dangerous than he's ever been and less careful. Watch for it. He's going to try one more thing, and it's going to be his worst thing, because he's not thinking clear anymore. I made him afraid, and afraid was never his weather. He doesn't know how to fight in it. She was right. She was nearly always right, and it had stopped surprising Caleb and started to feel like weather itself a thing you simply lived inside. Slade's worst thing came 6 days later, and it came wearing the law. Amos Caro's court convened in Fulton on the second Tuesday of the month, the way it had for 11 years, in the long room above the feed store. And on this particular Tuesday, the docket held a single item that had appeared on it with suspicious speed. In the matter of the water rights appurtenant to the McAllister parcel upstream boundary, on petition of V. Slade. Slade had reached for the law exactly as the parson Ambrose had warned he would when the crude tools failed. He had gone to his bought judge in his bought court to have Caleb's water rights voided on a technicality of filing a claim that McAllister's original deed had never properly recorded the upstream water appurtenance, and that absent that recording the rights, reverted to the valley's principal downstream holder. Vernon Slade. It was clever. It was, Hannah admitted when she read the filing. Pell smuggled up to them, genuinely clever, the last clever thing of a frightened man reaching past all the schemes that had failed to the one weapon he still fully owned. Because Caro would rule for him. Caro would rule for him inside of 10 minutes, and once Caro ruled, the water was Slade's by law, and then it didn't matter what a federal surveyor found next spring, because the local ruling would already stand, and the water would already be diverted, and the whole thing would be years in the untangling years the McAllisters didn't have. He's going to win it in Caro's court, Caleb said flatly, reading over her shoulder. You said yourself we could never beat him there. The bench was bought before I threw the first punch. I did say that. Hannah was very still, reading the filing a third time. And it's true. We can't beat him in Caro's court. She looked up. So we're not going to be in Caro's court. Hannah, there's a summons. We're ordered to appear Tuesday. If we don't show, he wins by default, and if we do show, he wins by Caro. There's no... We're going to appear. She set the paper down. We're going to appear, and we're going to lose, and it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to us. She turned to him, and there was that burning again, the thing that came into her when she saw the whole board while everyone else saw pieces. Caleb, listen to me. Slade's made one last mistake, and it's the biggest one yet, and he can't even see it, because he's too afraid to see straight anymore. He's put it in a courtroom, with a docket, with a record, with witnesses and testimony taken down by a clerk. She leaned in. For 6 years the whole strength of Vernon Slade was the dark. No record, no witnesses. A loose saw guard nobody would swear to. A survey in the shadows. A fire at midnight. Everything he ever did to you he did, where there was no paper. And now that he's frightened, now that he's lost his patience, he's going to stand up in a lit room in front of a clerk and a docket and put it on the record. He's going to make Amos Caro rule out loud in writing in a matter where the judge's own signature is already on Slade's illegal survey. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. He's about to create the one thing a federal review needs and never had. Proof. A written record of a bought judge ruling for the man who bought him. And he's going to hand it to us in open court and call it winning. Caleb stared at her. You want him to win in Caro's court. I want him to win loud, on paper, with Caro's name on the ruling and Slade's name on the petition, and the whole crooked machine running in daylight where it's finally written down. She gathered the filing. A federal reviewer looking at this case next spring sees nothing but a valley squabble, one man's word against another's, no proof of anything. But a federal reviewer looking at a court record where Judge Amos Caro, whose signature is already on Slade's 4-year-old illegal survey, which I have in that leather folder certified copy, where that same judge rules to strip a crippled veteran's water rights on a filing technicality and hand them to the very man whose survey he witnessed. She smiled that cold, burning smile. That's not a squabble anymore, Caleb. That's a pattern. That's a corrupt bench documented on the federal record with the judge's own signature tying the two halves together. Slade's about to build the case against himself in open court and stamp it with a judge's seal and think he's foreclosing on us. Caleb sat down slowly. And if the federal review never comes, if the surveyor's a year out or never comes at all, and Caro's ruling just stands, and Slade takes the water, and we lose the ranch waiting on a government that might never look? It was the real question, the one under all the others. Hannah did not flinch from it, because she never flinched from the real question. It was the thing he loved most in her, and feared most about her both at once. Then we lose the ranch, she said quietly. That's the truth. Caleb and I won't dress it up, because I'm no more capable of it than you are. If the federal review never comes, we lose. The bluff on the road, the bluff on the ridge, the whole of it, it was all buying time, and time runs out, and there was never any guarantee the government would come before it did. She reached across and took his rough hand in both of hers. I married a man who led with his ugliest truth, so I'll lead with mine. I don't know that we win this. I've made it more likely than it was. I've turned every one of Slade's strengths into a weakness one at a time, and I've made a frightened man do half our work for us. But I can't promise you the ending. Nobody could. All I can promise is that if we go down, we go down, having forced it into the light, having made the record, having made it so that even if Vernon Slade takes this water, he can never again take anything in the dark, because the dark's been broken open and it can't be closed. Her hands tightened on his. That's the fight I brought up this mountain. Not a guaranteed win. An honest fight fought in the open with everything face up. It's the only kind either of us knows how to fight. And I'd rather lose it with you than win any other kind with anyone else. Caleb McAllister looked at his wife, 3 weeks married now, the telegraph girl who'd cut a fire break in her nightdress and bluffed a powder keg off his mountain, and turned a rich man's certainty into a fever, and he understood that she'd just told him they might lose everything, and that it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him, and that he had never loved another living soul the way he loved her in that moment. Then we go to court Tuesday, he said, and we lose loud. We lose loud. She almost smiled. And Caleb, one more thing. When we go, I want the whole valley there. Every small farmer downstream. Every family that drinks off that creek. I want the room packed. Because Slade's counting on an empty courtroom the way he's always counted on empty dark. And a bought judge rules a lot bolder in an empty room than a full one. She stood. Tommy Rourke's going to ride the valley for me. That boy gave his lunch to hungry children all winter. Let's see what he can do with a real errand. By Tuesday, I want every soul in that valley to know that Vernon Slade is trying to take their water, and that they can come watch him do it. Let Caro rule for Slade in front of every family he's about to make drink at Slade's price. Let him do it to their faces. Yakutang. Tommy Rourke rode the valley for 3 days. He was 14 and freckled and honest to a fault, and it turned out that honesty in a valley that had lived 6 years under a rich man's shadow was a thing people had been starving for without knowing it. The boy told it plain the way Caleb had taught him and the way his own mother had raised him. Slade's going for the McAllister water, and if he gets it, he gets all of it, every creek and ditch and stock pond in the valley, at whatever price he cares to name. And you can come to Fulton Tuesday and watch, or you can stay home and find out the price later. They came. By Tuesday morning, the long room above the feed store was full, and then it was past full, and then men were standing in the stairwell and out in the street. Below the windows, small farmers in their Sunday coats, their wives beside them, the two mill hands who 4 years ago hadn't dared testify about a saw guard, now standing white-faced against the back wall, and Deborah Wills, who had ridden 90 miles from Millbrook the moment Hannah's letter reached her, standing in the front with her chin up like she was daring the whole room to try her. Vernon Slade had not expected a crowd. You could see it when he came in, that half-second falter, the same falter Hannah had put on his face on the road, the arithmetic starting up behind his eyes and not coming out right. He'd dressed for a quiet foreclosure. He'd walked into a packed room full of the faces he was about to make pay for their own water, and every one of those faces was turned to him, and not one of them was laughing. Nobody was laughing at the McAllisters anymore. That was the thing. 3 weeks ago, the whole county had slapped its knees over a one-legged man's notice. Now the one-legged man stood at the front of a packed courtroom with his wife beside him and the whole valley at his back, and Vernon Slade stood alone in his good coat, and the room understood the way a room understands things all at once exactly who the fool had been. Amos Caro took the bench. He was a dry, careful man, Caro gray and precise, and Hannah watched him take in the crowd the same way Slade had, and she watched him not like it, and she thought, good. A bought judge hates a full room. Let him hate it. "This is a civil matter," Caro said, and his voice was thinner than he meant it to be. "Not a spectacle. I'll have order, or I'll clear the room." "You'll not clear this room, Your Honor." It was Hannah who spoke before Caleb could, before Slade's lawyer could, Hannah stepping forward calm and clear in the blue dress. "These are the water users of this valley. Every soul in this room drinks off the creek that's the subject of your docket. They have a right to hear what's decided about the water in their own throats. You clear them, and you'll be ruling on their water behind a locked door. And I don't believe you want that on the record. Not today. Not with this many watching." On the record. She'd said it twice now, gentle, almost kind, and she watched Amos Caro hear it both times, and she watched him understand that she knew that this small, clear woman in the blue dress knew about his signature on the survey, knew what a record meant, knew exactly what she was building, and why she wanted it built in front of witnesses. Caro did not clear the room. Slade's lawyer laid out the petition. It was clean, technical, bloodless. The original McAllister deed had failed to properly record the upstream water appurtenance. Absent recordation, the rights were imperfect. Imperfect upstream rights reverted to the principal downstream holder. The principal downstream holder was Vernon Slade. The court was asked to void McAllister's water claim and confirm it in Slade. 10 minutes of dry law, and at the end of it, the water that fed the whole valley would belong to one man. And Amos Caro, exactly as Hannah had promised Caleb, he would prepared to rule for it. She saw him gathering to do it, saw the words assembling behind his gray, careful face, saw the whole bought machine grinding toward its foregone conclusion. Then Hannah McAllister asked to be heard, and Caro in a full room with the valley, watching, unable to refuse a wife the right to speak for her husband's land, without it looking exactly like what it was. Let her speak. "I'll be brief, Your Honor." She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. 11 years on the wire had taught her that the quietest voice in a room is the one everyone strains to hear. "Mr. Slade's petition rests on a filing technicality, a defect in how my husband's deed recorded the water. And I'll grant it, Your Honor. I'll grant the whole of it. The recordation may well be imperfect. My husband bought that land at 22 with more grit than lawyering, and I don't doubt the paperwork's got holes. She let that land let Slade's lawyer relax, let Slade himself lean back, thinking she'd conceded. But I'd ask the court one question before it rules, and I'd ask it be entered in the record, since we're all so concerned with what's properly recorded today." She turned not to Caro, but to the room. "The creek in question crosses a territorial line up on the high ridge north of my husband's fence before it drops back onto his land. That makes it an interstate water source. And an interstate water source, Your Honor, isn't a valley matter, and it isn't a territorial matter. It's a federal matter, under the jurisdiction of the United States Land Office, which has no bearing on this court's authority over the land, but which means this court has no authority whatsoever over the water." She turned back to Caro, and now her voice was very soft and very clear, and it carried to every corner of that packed and silent room. "You can rule on my husband's deed all day, Your Honor. But the moment you rule on the water, the moment you void a federal water right in a territorial court that has no jurisdiction over it, you're not making a decision. You're committing an act that a federal reviewer will one day read as a territorial judge knowingly exceeding his authority to benefit a private party." A breath. A private party, I'd note for the record, on whose survey of this very creek Your Honor's own signature appears as witness 4 years ago. Certified copy in my folder should the clerk wish to enter it. The room did not breathe. Amos Caro's gray, careful face went the color of old paper. Because she'd done it. In 3 sentences in a full room in front of the whole valley, and the clerk's pen, she'd laid it out, not accused him. Never accused him. Just noted for the record, the survey, the signature, the jurisdiction, the trap. She'd told him in language only he and Slade, and she fully understood that if he ruled for Slade today, he would be putting his own name a second time on the same crooked scheme in writing in a court record, in a matter he had no jurisdiction to touch in front of 100 witnesses, and that somewhere in a federal drawer, a survey request bearing Vernon Slade's own anxious inquiry was already maybe under review. She'd given Amos Caro a choice. Rule for Slade and hang himself on the federal record. Or, Caro was a bought man. But he was not a stupid one, and a bought man's first loyalty, always in the end, is to himself. "The court finds," Amos Caro said slowly, and his voice had gone flat and careful and very, very quiet, "that the water rights at issue being appurtenant to an interstate source fall outside the jurisdiction of this court." He did not look at Slade. He could not look at Slade. "The petition, insofar as it concerns the water, is dismissed for want of jurisdiction. The parties are referred to the Federal Land Office. This matter is closed." For one heartbeat, the room did not understand. Then it did. And the sound that went up from 100 small farmers who'd come to watch their water taken and had instead watched it saved that sound. Caleb McAllister would tell Hannah, years later, was the finest thing he ever heard in his life. Finer than her voice off the wire. Finer than 4 words on a telegram. A sound like a valley remembering it was allowed to breathe. Vernon Slade came to his feet. "Your Honor." His voice cracked, and everyone heard it crack. The smooth, patient certainty gone entirely now, stripped down to a frightened rich man in a room full of people who'd just watched him lose. "Your Honor, you can't the deed, the recordation defect we've established. I've ruled Mr. Slade." Caro gathered his papers and would not meet the man's eyes, because Caro had just chosen himself over Slade the way bought men always do in the end, and both of them knew it, and it was the loneliest kind of betrayal, the kind with no witnesses that mattered, and no recourse at all. "Take it to the federal office if you've the standing, though I'd think carefully were I you about inviting federal eyes onto that creek." A pause dry as dust. Some men are better served by the matter simply ending. Courts adjourned, and Vernon Slade, who had bought a coroner and a judge and half a valley, who had taken a man's leg in the dark and slept fine, who had ruled 6 years by the simple law that nobody would ever look too close. Vernon Slade stood alone in a room that had finally looked and found that his money had bought him a judge who would abandon him the instant the looking started, and that he had in the end, exactly as Hannah had promised, beaten himself. He never took the water. He never took the ranch. The federal surveyor came the following spring, whether bumped forward by Slade's own anxious wire or simply arrived in its slow season. Hannah never knew, and said it didn't matter, and stood on the high ridge and confirmed the interstate crossing, and confirmed Caleb McAllister's upstream rights under federal protection, permanent and unbreakable, beyond the reach of any territorial court or any rich man's money for all time. And with the federal record open, the old survey surfaced and Caro's signature on it. And though nothing was ever proven about a saw guard 4 years gone, the judge did not ride the circuit much longer after that. And Vernon Slade's grip on the valley, which had been built entirely of dark, came apart in the daylight, one creditor and one freed farmer at a time. But that was later. The morning after the courtroom, Caleb McAllister woke before dawn out of old habit and reached for the rifle that had leaned by the bed for 3 weeks, and then remembered he didn't need it, and lay still a moment in the gray light, listening to his wife breathe beside him, and understood that the war was over, and he had lived through it, and he was not alone. He got up quiet and made the coffee and carried 2 cups out to the wide porch step he had built with his own 2 hands and 1 good leg, the step he'd sat on the one side of for 3 years, telling himself he was a fool. Hannah came out a few minutes later, wrapped in a shawl against the mountain cool, and sat down beside him on the side that had been empty. Ruin climbed up and lay across both their feet. And the sun came up over the ridge the way it had come up 10,000 times, before Caleb ever built the step, and would come up 10,000 times after, and for the first time in his life, Caleb McAllister watched it come up next to someone. "You know what he never understood," Hannah said after a while, her hands around the warm cup. "Slade, 6 years and he never understood the one thing." "What's that?" "That the dark only has power over people who've got something to hide in it." She leaned into his shoulder. "You never had anything to hide. That's why he could never truly beat you even before I came, even when you were losing every round. He kept trying to drag you into the dark, and you kept standing in the light saying, 'Here I am, 1 leg, 300 acres. I do not pretend to be what I am not.' You'd already done the thing he was threatening to do to you. You'd already exposed yourself, on purpose in a newspaper, to the whole laughing county. There was nothing left he could reveal. You'd taken the weapon out of his hand 4 years before he ever knew he'd lost it." She turned her face up to him. "That notice everyone laughed at. That was the bravest thing I ever heard of a man doing. You stood in the light before you had any reason to believe the light would be kind, and I read it 90 miles away, and I thought there's a man who can't be blackmailed because he's already told the truth. There's the only safe man in the world, the honest one." Caleb was quiet a long moment, watching the light come up the mountain. "I put the leg first because I thought no one would answer," he said. "I truly did. I thought I'd tell the ugliest truth I had and prove to myself one last time that honesty gets a man nothing, and then I'd stop hoping and I'd be able to bear the rest of my life alone." He turned to her, and instead, one person in the whole county answered, and it was the one person who'd spent 11 years learning to tell truth from lies. "And she came up my mountain and cut a fire break in her nightdress and beat a rich man with words she made up on a wagon seat and never once, not for 1 hour, considered running." His voice went rough. "I led with the worst thing about myself to keep from hoping, and it turned out to be the thing that built my whole life." Hannah set down her cup and took his rough, weathered hand in both of hers and held it the way she'd held it across the plank table that first night with the butcher paper. "Then we understand each other," she said. "Same as we did in one line of newsprint. Same as we always will." She looked at him steady, the telegraph girl who read the truth under everything. "A man who leads with his truth has already lost the only thing that could ever be taken from him. He's got nothing left to hide, and nothing left to fear, and nothing left to do but build." And Caleb McAllister sat on the wide porch step he had built for a hope he'd told himself was dead in the risen sun, next to the woman who had answered, when the whole world laughed with the valley, safe below them, and the water running free off the ridge, and the ruined old dog warm across both their feet. And he knew all the way down to the hickory foot he stood on that his notice had told the truth twice over. He had 1 leg. He had 300 acres, and he did not pretend to be what he was not. And it was that last thing, that one true thing, the thing the whole county had laughed at, that had brought him everything he would ever need, and would go on bringing it quiet and steady and unbreakable every single day for the rest of his long and honest life.